Hello, everyone, and welcome to Ludwig II, the Night King. A week ago, I introduced or released an introduction to this stream, but for the benefit of those who haven't watched that video, I'll reread the introduction here. I went through many titles for this video, searching for something to encapsulate Ludwig II, King of Bavaria. The most cliches of these titles were the fairy tale monarch and the Swan King, the latter being the title of McIntosh's recent biography. Fairy tale, in reference to Walt Disney's indebtedness to the aesthetics of Neuschwanstein for the original Disney castle, and Swan for Ludwig's association with Lohengrin, the Swan Knight. Then there is the lesser-known title of Unsere Kini, our king, in the Bavarian dialect, an indicator of the affection that many Bavarian patriots, even secessionists, have for their late king, the most prominent of these being the members of the Gugelmänner secret society. Ludwig, as Unsere Kini of Bavaria, is to conceive of him as the archetypal king asleep under the mountain, who once awake will reclaim his throne. In the case of Ludwig, the king asleep at the bottom of Lake Starnberg. The irony of this title is that Ludwig was first and foremost a German nationalist, to the point of scolding those using the Bavarian dialect in his presence. From his paranoia diagnosis, his deposition, and suicide, we arrive at Ludwig the Mad. Mad in the sense he would travel between residences at the dead of night in his ostentatious Rococo gala sleigh. The thumbnail you can see is a painting version of that. Indeed, one of the novelties of this sleigh is that the light, of course, you can see having a candlelight whistling through the night. It during the height of winter would virtually be impossible. So this was not only a gala sleigh, a Rococo gala sleigh, but a sleigh with a early iteration of the light bulb to add to the the further sort of idiosyncrasies. At the palaces of Herrenchiemsee and Linderhof, Ludwig had specially constructed wishing tables that could mechanically lift his meals into his dining room without the need for human interaction. In some instances, he would remain in seclusion until finally summoning a servant for fear of losing the capacity for speech. I find questions around the specific nature of his mental health the least interesting aspect of Ludwig, as if we could acquire a more nuanced understanding of the man by slotting him into a medical category. Indeed, as far as that really influences my views, it really pertains to historiography, what people have read into the diagnosis as opposed to the specifics of the diagnosis itself. So does Ludwig's reign equate to eccentricity, madness, or more precisely, the doomed search for a perfect royal absolutism, if not in Bavaria, then in the realm of fantasy? To help illustrate this point, I have always been drawn to this engraving by Gustave Doré, not of Ludwig, but of Cervantes' Don Quixote, a man out of time, crowded by anachronisms, relics of a medieval past. This despite Don Quixote having been written over 2 centuries before Ludwig's birth. The caption on the engraving reads, "A world of disorderly notions picked out of his books, crowded into his own imagination." Of the many inspirations Ludwig took for his own self-conception of kingly dignity, none figures so prominently as his namesake Louis XIV of France. Louis XIV, le roi soleil, Sun King, modelled after the Greek god Apollo. As the embodiment of royal absolutism, the king was the centre of a solar system around which the court was structured, his radiance imbuing France with grandeur. Yet it would be absurd to call Ludwig a second Sun King. Like Louis XIV, Ludwig was a great builder of palaces, but whereas Louis's palaces were meant as statements of political authority, Ludwig's were personal, isolated, sacred spaces. Against the conspicuous splendor of the sun, Ludwig was a recluse, seeking solace in isolation, in loneliness. In opposition to le roi soleil, he was the roi de la nuit, the night king, taken literally as he lived at night, night king figuratively as the king of dreams, and night king politically as the de facto terminus of his royal house of Wittelsbach and of European absolutism outside of Russia. His era represented the Dark Age, the twilight, the Götterdämmerung of monarchy before its ultimate demise. Even the Apollonian sum motifs of Louis XIV pervading the royal bedchambers at Herrenchiemsee and Linderhof, the bedchamber, representing the epicenter, the nucleus of Ludwig's castles, had inverted the vitality, dynamism, and passion of the royal red into a somber, icy blue, blue representing both night and chastity, as the royal bed was robbed of its intended function as the factory of royal heirs. The king never married, he never kept a mistress, and the question of his homosexuality looms over his legacy to this day. As was later said by Gabriel D'Annunzio, Louis of Bavaria is truly a king, but only as the king of his dreams. I'll be referencing 3 books primarily for this stream. One is Genius and Magic by Cavaliero, A Cultural History of Germany, The Swan King by Christopher McIntosh, and A Different Kind of King by Spangenberg. With reference to Cavaliero in particular, he has a very sort of novel, interesting way in terms of interrogating the German history of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. And he does so essentially by focusing on the smaller German states, the minor principalities, not Austria or Germany, which I focused on extensively elsewhere in the channel, the essence of German dualism. Instead, it is a remarkably non-Prussian centric cultural history. And in terms of being able to sum up the nature of the other Germanies outside of the Prussian-Austrian dynamic, he uses the term Pumpernickel. And what he means by Pumpernickel, it is a collective, idiosyncratic description of the principalities of pre-imperial Germany. Pumpernickel derives from Thackeray's excursions into the pocket handkerchief size Grand Duchy of Karlsbraten Pumpernickel in the Fitzbudel Papers and Vanity Fair, in the sense as parody of the, at that time, hundreds of tiny little German princelings. Pumpernickel was one of the components of that air, wind, rather of abstractions and eccentricities, of which, in John Paul Richter's words, Germany had the empire, a very much empire in quotes. Thackeray's lofty detachments from their grand ducal triviality was worthy of the Punch editorial table, and was intended to cast a comic light on the ferment of intellectual energy many of them were experiencing. But Thackeray's was too lofty to perceive that this ferment was questioning the position of God, of man, of nature, of sensibility, drinking deep of the elixir of the romance that was beginning to sweep across Europe at that time. The German princes may have been as essentially as powerless in the face of their final destiny as they were their Italian counterparts, the destiny being of unification, especially in the case of Ludwig. But the Romantic Renaissance was to be every bit as profound. And of course, another aspect of the anachronism here is German culture operating in a iteration of the straitjacket. So introducing the idea of the pumpernickel little states that were so ridiculed in Punch and Vanity Fair, and then coming to the whole issue of language, which bears special consideration on Ludwig II of Bavaria. Back to Cavaliero. In Karl's words, French lay like a baleful incubus over the far nobler mind of Germany, and all true nationality vanished from its literature, or was heard only in faint tones, but could not reach the ears of foreigners. And of course, that's one of the services that Carlyle effectively renders us, is bringing over a lot of German Romantic thinkers and translating them into English, being that conduit between the German Enlightenment and the Scottish Enlightenment, or rather Romantic period. I hesitate to use the word Enlightenment when it comes to Carlyle. France dominated language, clothes, cuisine, furnishings, dance, music, and even illnesses. In the palaces that each little prince had aimed to build like Louis XIV, life was to be as like a French court as possible, even though in its essential grossness and provincialism it might retain the features of an older Germany. Voltaire in 1759, when he wrote Candide, was not impressed by the castle of the Thunder Ten Tronckh, where his hero was born, again a parody of Voltaire's Nightmare. To display the baron's greatness, the castle had a great gate, a marvel of marvels, windows of glass, and its hall hung with tapestries. There was a pack of hounds that ran wild in the farm and could be mustered for hunting. The baroness weighed around 25 stones, and everyone behaved as if the Baron Thunder Ten Tronckh was somebody. Richter's prince would employ French instructors in the kitchen, the garden, and the stables to ensure that nobler life approximated to what went on in Versailles. A growing child might utter his first words in French, and from then on he would only hear German used to address soldiers and horses. In the context of Ludwig, the fascinating aspects of combining all of these elements of that shackled German culture, that provincialism that was held underneath by a elite French culture, and the whole notion of the small estate, the pumpernickel. Ludwig II, in many ways, is the superlative iteration of all of these things, and he also represents the end of these things in a way. You can say that with the death of Ludwig II, we have the death of this Frenchified, courtly, pumpernickel-esque monarchy. And again, the idea of these minor dukedoms or even kingdoms, in the case of Ludwig II, elevating themselves with these ever grander pretensions, building castles, ever greater gates. Of course, in Ludwig II, the comparisons with Neuschwanstein, the Disney castle, with Herrenchiemsee, with Linderhof, with the older Hohenschwangau, and indeed the castles of his predecessors, the Munich residence, etc. All of this should compound the idea of the sort of context in which someone like Ludwig II could arise and also inhabit such a strong impression in terms of the imagination. And of course, in terms of all of this, we're talking about this within the overall sort of trajectory towards German unification, this being the situation of German high society. But Ludwig II, of course, is not simply an aspect of this. He represents all of the influences of his age. And among one of these things, he was a convinced German nationalist, which is going to play a significant role when we talk about the political aspirations of Ludwig II. And indeed, as we see that German may have been overheard in terms of speaking to the servants or speaking to the horses, when Ludwig II heard the Bavarian dialect, he would chastise his servants for utilizing it. Yet he was also appealing to this Francophile culture that had been inspired by French cultural hegemony in Germany before the rise of Napoleon. Even though by the beginning of the 19th century we have the rise of Schiller and we have the rise of Goethe, of Hegel, etc. All of these elements are to simply say again that all of this is happening within the shadow of France. Really, you can say that Germany looms under the shadow until unification, until you have that physical embodiment of the unification with the creation of the German Empire, but also the martial unification through the defeat of France at the same time. So Ludwig encapsulated German nationalism, this anarchic sense of Francophilia and wanting to belong to the cultural sphere of France, especially when it comes to looking back to the legacy of Louis XIV in particular. Yet he was also the most grandiose of these little German princelings. And what I mean by little German princelings is that he represents Bavaria. And indeed, Bavaria is remarkable in the sense of modern Germany, in that it is one of these little German principalities that is able essentially to survive. Its culture cuts through the whole process of German unification. And even to this day, Bavaria has a very strong sense of not only political devolution and autonomy within Germany, but a notable secessionist movement, among other things. And indeed, you can say that Bavaria essentially is the German equivalent to Austria. However, Bavaria just so happens to be lumped in with the rest of the Federal Republic of Germany. All of these elements, again, to concede that Ludwig II was, in many senses, successful in a way that perhaps many of his pumpernickel counterparts were not. But as King of Bavaria, he had a lot of negative antecedents, curses, essentially, which hung over his reign, which would doom it to a sense of inevitable tragedy. Coming back to, what was it, a phrase by Nicholas II, who referred to his reign as, "I am Job the long-suffering," effectively. Well, in the case of Ludwig II, who came to the throne in 1864, right on the cusp of German unification, just off the back of the Second Schleswig-Holstein War, the popular conception, which is holding true over the minds of many Bavarians, is the curse of one Lola Montes. Indeed, if you watch Hans-Jürgen Seiberberger's film, Ludwig, Requiem for a Virgin Queen, it begins with a very uh, foreboding, dynamic presentation of the Norns, the Muses, the Fates, pronouncing the curse of Lola Montes upon Ludwig, and this, of course, is going to be via his association with Richard Wagner. It's interesting to say, really, whether Ludwig would still have the same sort of notoriety in Germany had it not been for his patronage, indeed his saving of Richard Wagner. but I would say even without Wagner, even though it's impossible to think of Ludwig's intellectual development and cultural development without Wagner, Ludwig's own personality would make him stand out within the context of 19th century German history. So going back to Cavaliero, he has a short segment on Lola Montes and how it affected the reign of his grandfather, namesake, and indeed you can say the monarch which Ludwig II most wanted to emulate within his own line of Wittelsbach, his grandfather. The spirit of Pumpernickel was to surface in Bavaria with extraordinary vigour with the accession in 1825 of Maximilian's heir. Maximilian was the first king of Bavaria, Ludwig, Louis I. He was 39, born in 1786 when his father was a French officer, and he had been a godson of the ill-fated Louis XVI, whose name he took as heir apparent to the Bavarian throne. He had been unwillingly obliged to participate in Napoleon's 1809 war with Austria that ended at Wagram, that being the War of the Fifth Coalition. And Ludwig's was a powerful voice in persuading his father to change sides and join the alliance that followed Napoleon's Russian debacle. The monarchy in Bavaria, prior to the 19th century, Bavaria had been an electorate, which was a very prominent position within the grand scheme of German princes. In the 14th century, Wittelsbach, the family which Ludwig was a part of, the Bavarian dynasty, had even produced an emperor before the Habsburgs did. So the Wittelsbach were an ancient and storied dynasty. However, the title of king, which again, within the context of the Holy Roman Empire, this is post-Holy Roman Empire, was not the grant of ancient sort of Bavarian patrimony, but the ascension from electorate to king was in fact the grant of Napoleon specifically. So I mentioned the idea of the legacy of Louis XIV and the legacy of France hanging over all of Germany. Well, Bavaria's own ascension to the rank of kingdom is indebted to France. Indeed, you can see on this map on the left, the sort of pale green image right at the center is the Kingdom of Bavaria, which is more or less the modern day borders of Bavaria, with the major exception being the Palatinate. This larger territory was also the result of Bavaria choosing the right side at the right time during the French Napoleonic Wars. Now that he was king, Ludwig I, he was able to put the clock back in an ideal world that existed before the Great Revolution, the French Revolution. Even so, he was not a complete reactionary. Bavaria needed to generate wealth, and Ludwig did not stand in the way of industrialization, digging a canal between the Danube and the main rivers to facilitate transport and building a railway as far as Nuremberg. Nuremberg, which was traditionally not part of Bavaria, but had come so thanks to the engorgement of Bavaria during the Napoleonic Wars. But that was as far as his modernity went. Ludwig looked back, following the intellectual fashion of the day, to an age of imagined German glory in the Middle Ages. He restored some of the suppressed monasteries and gave himself pompous royal, even imperial titles, again looking back to this medieval patrimony. And in particular, the emperor, who was also a Wittelsbach, just happened to have the name Louis. He revived in himself the Wittelsbach line that had formerly expired when Charles Theodore succeeded to the electorate. What that means is that the dynasty of Ludwig II belonged to a cadet branch of the Wittelsbach dynasty, kind of like Capetian to the Valois to the Bourbon of France. Above all, he threw himself into building, into collecting art, and into writing bad poetry. His passion for all things Hellenic made him an enthusiastic supporter of Greek independence, and in 1832 his son Otto was persuaded to become the first king of Greece. He amassed Greek and Roman sculpture for his classically designed museums, and in addition to altering the largely medieval face of Munich, he sent his architects to help his son give his capital Athens a suitably neoclassical appearance. He even decreed that his country should be called Bayern, using the Hellenic upsilon instead of the Latin letter I. Above all, he had a wholly neoclassical fondness for classical beauties, whom he immortalized in his Gallery of Beauties, and though was hard of hearing and married with 8 children, who took with whom he could to bed. For a short time, he was a lover of the society beauty heiress Jane Digby, who left him for another Bavarian nobleman, who was father to her son. But he entered into a more enduring relationship, largely for ill, with a notorious Irish horizontale, Lola Montes, who was originally christened Eliza Rosanna Gilbert. She was Irish, obviously. Lola Montes was born in Ireland in 1821, child of the 15-year-old Edward Gilbert, ensign in a regiment destined for India, who died of cholera shortly after arriving there. Eliza's mother quickly married another ensign, and the young Eliza grew up in a paradise for children, wayward and spoiled. Sent home to England for education, she grew in wildness and in beauty, mistaken for a child of mixed blood, and acquiring enough learning to wish for no more. To get back to India, she eloped at the age of 16 with a Lieutenant James, who she abandoned by mutual consent in Calcutta to become a dancer. In Paris, Lola managed to captivate Franz Liszt, who introduced her to the former lover, the great granddaughter of the Saxon condottiere Maurice de Saxe. Franz Liszt, of course, was one of the great virtuosos, pianists, a friend of Richard Wagner, and patronized by the Duke of Saxe-Weimar. In the Salon of Georges Sand, Lola develops some social, if raffish, literary arts that introduce her to the Seraglio of Alexander Dumas Père. Thence, in 1846, on the death of her lover of the day, she went to Munich, where it was not difficult to catch the eye of the septuagenarian king. It was probably malicious gossip that she did this by baring her breast to show him that she was really that well endowed, and progression to royal mistress was quick. Soon a reincarnated Lagravenitz stalked the corridors of Munich. The Munchers were not averse to their monarch's choice of two foreigners as his maîtresses en titre, official mistresses, both remarkably lovely in their way. But Jane Digby had the sense not to stay around and interfere. Lola was, by contrast, incautious and greedy. The Muncheners soon realized that she was not good either for houses, jewels, and works of art. Was not good either for Ludwig or for Bavaria. And when they learned that, in addition to all the houses, jewels, and works of art that Ludwig lavished on her, she wanted a title and acceptance as a naturalized Bavarian citizen. And she used to boast that what Lola wants, Lola gets. Their anger began to show. Ludwig II was tiring of being a constitutional monarch. He had already secured a clerically conservative ministry that was under the influence of the Restored Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, inexorably rescinding the liberal laws that had allowed freedom of conscience in the press, this being in the context of Bavaria effectively being a Napoleonic construct, so liberal even within the context of Germany of the 19th century. It was becoming dangerous to voice any criticism of the royal family or of affairs of state, which seemed to be controlled by Lola. When the chief minister of a subservient but clerical administration sent a memorandum to the king expressing reservations about naturalizing Lola, she had him dismissed. She secured her title as the Countess of Landesfeld, and a new ministry accorded her naturalization papers, becoming a Bavarian citizen. But trouble was brewing. The parody of the Lord's Prayer, beseeching God to give Lola her daily prerequisites of house and home, to forgive her excesses and lead her not into penury, echoed what had been prayed about Lagravenets in Württemberg during the last century, that in specific reference to a infamous incident involving a court Jew in the 18th century in Württemberg, which was again a large German state in Swabia. Lola seemed quite insensitive to criticism and foiled every attempt of the new chief minister to form an administration. When protests convulsed the university, Ludwig dismissed the professors, arrested their students, and suspended the constitution, the Napoleonic constitution. What was put in place of the dissolved assembly was dubbed the Ministry of Lola. But it was in March of 1848, when the virus of revolution was abroad in Europe, when Ludwig dismissed the Lola ministry, but not Lola. The normally complacent Müncheners exploded into rage. Both Ludwig and his woman had to go. And go they went, Lola to Switzerland, hoping in vain to be joined by Ludwig, who abdicated in favour of his son, another Maximilian. The fall of the bad angel was sudden and it was final. So this is the context in which Ludwig II essentially is ascending the throne after the premature death of his father, Maximilian. There had been a history essentially of French convocation when it came to the constitution and interference, Bavaria being, despite the pretensions of Ludwig and Ludwig II, a grandiose medieval state, essentially bound by a liberal Napoleonic constitution, with the spectre of revolution hanging over Bavaria as it hung over the rest of Europe, Italy, France. Austria. Indeed, a month before, Louis Philippe of France had also lost his throne. But what makes Bavaria stand out within this grand context is that Bavaria's revolution was seen to be associated with the character of Lola Montez. So, what does Ludwig II do when he unexpectedly comes to the throne at age 18? In the eyes of the people of Munich, he creates this situation again with a royal favorite, his own iteration of a maîtresse en titre, intervening in the state of affairs of his kingdom and essentially wresting the king away from the love of his subjects. But of course, this isn't going to be an Irish mistress who is supposedly well endowed, but indeed Richard Wagner himself, the composer who, if you want to know more about him, I also have a video on this channel called Richard Wagner, the Sorcerer of Bayreuth. So this is a segment of Cavaliero which is focused essentially on their relationship. It's also going to form a backdrop of an overall biography of the reign of Ludwig before I get into more specific aspects of his reign. Wagner at 47 was the uncrowned king of Germany's musical castle, whereas Mendelssohn's have flowed like an enchanted decay over conjugal love. Wagner's music was the melody of the potion, an envenomed mixture which tested the power of redemptive through usually thwarted love. In terms of the specific reference to Mendelssohn that Cavaliero is bringing forth here, one has to come back again to the idea that Germany was operating under the shadow of French culture, that its courtly culture was indebted to France, that German was considered a provincial language, that even the vernacular iterations of Bavarian were considered even lower than German, and that what Wagner represented was a musical and cultural reckoning against this Francophone culture, which again makes Ludwig all the more interesting as representing both sides of that, the Francophile culture and this sense of a new German cultural awakening. In the case of Wagner, this is stipulated against Mendelssohn specifically in his treatise on Jewishness and music, as Jewishness essentially is to represent a absence of a fulfilled German culture. In order essentially to have the music of the future, one needs to be able to create a German consciousness. And Ludwig, in terms of Wagner's own conception of his future, coming towards the Bayreuth Festival, is going to have to realize this. Above the often turgid prose of his own poems, Wagner's, which had to untangle the complications of story, he had chosen to adopt at his starting point. He spun compacted skeins that developed into musical of an ethereal and sometimes magical beauty. Unlike the Jewish music of Mendelssohn, which Bernard Shaw thought had descended into Sunday school piety, Wagner tackled the psychological drama he found in his sources, the saga of the German Minnesingers, the German folk legends, the Nibelungs of Nibelheim, the German courts, the guilds of the Meistersingers, and the Germanic amorality of passionate love. So deliberately post-Christian also. Your typical Englishman is your typical sheep, and a groundling his love, presumably that of any non-German, must be sheep-like. That's in specific reference to the fact that Mendelssohn spent his later career in England. Wagner, for his part, had discovered the true virtue of love. If the will was frustrated by human efforts, love, despite all obstacles, could soar above them, and even when betrayed, could achieve redemption for the lover, no matter how compromised. It was no wonder that the grandson of Ludwig I of Bavaria, the lover of the wild Irish beauty Lola Montez, carrying out his grandfather's mission to make Munich the intellectual and artistic capital of Europe, as soon as to read Wagner's Nibelung poem, saw the intense Germanness of it. In 1864, upon becoming king, he invited him to complete the mighty work in the kingdom of the mountains, rivers, and forests, a suitable home for the modern Nibelung. There, true love, German love, could finally thrive. The Nibelungs, who, after all, were Norwegian dwarves, could scarcely be the personification of the German personality, but the 13th century tale was German enough, with its familiar thread of greed and treachery, sexual attraction, and chicanery. This in reference specifically to the sagas, which are not only Norwegian, they're also Icelandic. But there's also the other elements of the Nibelung appealing to the Nibelung Lied, which is a tale about the German tribe, the Burgundians, in the 5th century. The Wagner oeuvre had so far explored this mixture in a purely human forum, where despite the virtue of kings like Henry the Fowler and of knights like Lohengrin, Henry the Fowler being essentially the first king of what we can perhaps conceive of as Germany as distinct from France, human affairs were subject to corruption and failure. The purest Elizabeths and Elsas, both heroines in Wagner, Elizabeth being the Elsa, Elizabeth being the heroine of Tannhäuser, and Elsa being the heroine of Lohengrin, crossed by human weakness. Now the role of the extra-human, of fairies or flying Dutchmen, of gods and goddesses and supernaturally conceived heroes, not subject to the laws of pessimism or failure of the will, which Wagner had learned from his obsessive reading of Schopenhauer, was to reveal that it too was subject to the laws of life and death. In his symphonic poems on a grand scale, and again that is indebted to Liszt, he would demonstrate the vanity of all human wishes. They could also be proof of the redemptive role of music and love. Humans, like Tristan and Isolde, might be indissolubly joined in a passionate, drug-induced love, but if they might consume it, they might not enjoy it. Wagner was to show that even love between heroes like Siegfried and Brunhilde could not immortalize it. Love was only a temporary palliative to life's inevitable misery and futility, which is why it could only end in disappointment or in an orgasm of catastrophe. Music alone could only extend and support climax, a tonal Viagra, to be the fulfiller of our will to live and consequently our reconciler to night and death. In the last analysis, there was only the Rhine maidens who were truly and pointlessly immortal, for theirs was a sterile love for essentially useless gold. In March of 1864, Ludwig had become king of Bavaria. He was still only 18, tall, athletic, and handsome. Moreover, he had the receptive brain of an actor, and as kingcraft was largely an act, Ludwig II filled his role at the outset to perfection. He had already committed most of Wagner's poems to memory, thanks to his amazingly extensive memory, and hearing that Wagner was in deep financial trouble, he determined to be both his savior and his patron. Savior also in the artistic and inspirational sense, not just in the financial sense or even in the protective sense. Wagner was only too ready to be saved and patronized. Just to compound this illustration, this is the first segment from McIntosh's The Swan King, which is less Wagner focused than Cavaliero's account, but nevertheless it's interesting simply to buttress this point, because again one of the inspirations was not just Wagner but also Schiller. So this is from McIntosh's The Swan King. In the arts, Ludwig II sought to have his ideals projected into words and image. He loved Schiller, for example, for his lofty conception of heroism, and it was through a Schiller play that he first met the actor Ernst Posart, who was to play the important part in his theatrical interest. Posart performed before Ludwig for the first time in October of 1864 in the unsympathetic role of the scheming secretary Wurm in Schiller's Cabal and Liebe. Ludwig was impressed by Posart's acting in the early part of the play, and in the interval sent his aide-de-camp to congratulate the theatre director on having engaged the actor. This compliment, relayed to Posart in his dressing room, spurred him on to be better at acting in the latter part of the play, and after the final curtain the king stood in his box applauding while the audience called out Posart's name. Posart was invited to an audience with Ludwig, and 2 days later he reported at the residence in Munich in a very nervous mood. His account of the visit in his autobiography proceeds. I was shown into a wide, three-windowed room with light blue wallpaper, in the middle of which was a clump of enormous potted palms. Anxious moments passed. Nothing broke the stillness. Suddenly I gave a start when out from greenery stepped a slim figure, towering above average human height, and approaching me slowly and ceremoniously. I was breathless. Raising myself from a deep bow, I found this majestic figure close in front of me. I had to tilt my head simply backwards in order to look him in the face, but my gaze could take in nothing but two powerful steel-grey eyes, framed in dark eyelashes, which looked penetratingly into my own and held them captive. Now the king was speaking to me in a quiet, kindly-sounding tone, but I could not grasp the words. I just looked spellbound, at the lofty, shining stars. Possart was one of the many people from the world of the arts, actors, actresses, poets, painters, architects, composers, with which Ludwig felt a rapport. But one artist loomed larger, and that, of course, was Wagner. So returning to Wagner. Wagner was struggling with Tristan and Isolde, and it was in despair of ever finding singers, let alone a theatre and the money to perform it. Ludwig offered to cancel all of Wagner's debts, give him an annual pension and a house, and promised that he completed the Ring, he would pay him the colossal sum of 30,000 guilders and build both a theatre to which to perform it and a musical school in which to forge new singers. It was like the opening of heaven to Wagner, a God-given dream to find a beautiful, gifted, and munificent prince who understood him so well and was determined is free to spread its mighty opinions to the ethereal regions of your heavenly art. The king ordered productions, The Flying Dutchman and Tristan in Munich. Wagner was to be Ludwig's Lohengrin, Ludwig's Wagner, Siegfried. They met daily, Wagner flying to him like a lover. They were soulmates. For Wagner, it was not a homosexual love affair. He had found a worshipping acolyte who had the means to fulfill his fondest dreams, to have the Nibelung performed exactly as he wanted. He was to be his own master, not a Meister, which was a position he had back in Saxony, Wagner. Ludwig knows everything about me. He understands me, like my own soul. That was more than he expected of a Matilda, Mina, even Cosima, these being Wagner's. Effectively, Matilda Wesendonck was a mistress, Mina and Cosima were his wives. For Ludwig, the infatuation may have been almost female, and it was not long before the memories of the expensive and domineering Lola Montes began to occupy the minds of the courtiers, some of whom referred to the new king's new crony as Lolus, Lotta, essentially a masculine form of Lola. Despite the exchange of these quote-unquote love letters, Wagner's full of thanks, Ludwig of promises of future support, the hothouse relationship of artist and patron was too heated to last. Journalists unearthed Wagner's revolutionary antecedents in Dresden and began to accuse him of being a danger to both public order and morality, and causing extravagant expenditure that threatened to ruin the Bavarian economy. Emphasis on these quote-unquote love letters. Notice how I went to Siebenberger's idea of Requiem for a Virgin King, the Night King, the idea of Ludwig being a Catholic. If he was a homosexual, effectively, it never translated, as far as I'm aware, into being carnal. Indeed, Ludwig II was so fastidious in this regard that he had a personal crusade against masturbation. So when we're talking about love, we can't really conceive of it in terms of the debased eroticism of what we'd associate it with today. And also you can look at the letters that they exchange, the emphasis on this idea of a soulmate, as again typical of this 19th century German sort of counterposition, counterpoint to Victorian Stoicism as overwrought German romantic sort of infatuation, and romantic in the philosophical sense, in the artistic sense, and not in the erotic sense. Ludwig, in words which promise an eternal friendship and support, advised his withdrawal for a time, and Wagner removed himself once more to Switzerland, ostensibly for his health. He would never return to live in Munich unless he was given Bavarian citizenship. That request sealed his exile. It was too close to the unhappy example of Lola Montes. It was now also clear that despite Ludwig's passionate protests, he could only resume the relationship if he abdicated like his grandfather. This Wagner could not allow. A penniless king in exile was not his idea of a patron, now that the production of The Ring was only like to be possible in Munich. He advised the king to act with circumspection, to do nothing rash, and continue to subsidize his work. Public opinion in the city was exacerbated by rumors of Wagner's liaison with Cosima in Switzerland, while Bülow, Wagner's chief exponent, had to stay in Munich to prepare for the performance of Wagner's operas. But if Wagner had found a new emotional toy, then Ludwig had too, and his courtiers, almost sighing for the days of Lola Montes, tried to encourage affairs with visiting actresses, while his mother schemed with the mother of the Empress Elizabeth, wife of Franz Joseph of Austria, for the hand of her younger sister Sophie. As a wife for Ludwig, Sophie was a Wagner enthusiast, and the young couple refer to each other by Wagnerian names. Soon, Elsa and Heinrich were engaged. Both Wagner and Cosima were delighted. Wagner glad to know that the relationship of patron and artist would not be disturbed. Cosima hoping for the destruction of an uncomfortably adoring rival. In the case of looking at those names, Elsa and Heinrich, Heinrich, if I recall, is the Duke of Brabant in the opera Lohengrin. So the idea of Sophie and Ludwig referring to themselves as Elsa and Heinrich is to emphasize their unequal status. Elsa may be the adoring, fawning princess, but it is Ludwig II who has magisterium. He has authority in this regard. He is not Lohengrin the knight as he is to Wagner. Instead, he is Heinrich. He is the Duke of Brabant. And perhaps in terms of that conception, in terms of how they identify each other in their letters, you can understand effectively how their relationship was in many ways doomed from the beginning. And just to compound this, one letter from Ludwig II to Sophie quite illustrates this well in terms of why their relationship fell apart. Obviously, a royal match and them getting married, Sophie von Wittelsbach and Ludwig II would have dispelled any rumors of a love affair, a physical love affair between Wagner and the king, but also any lingering questions of his homosexuality. And also, it would have acted as a way to tame the king. It would be a way essentially of forcing him to observe the rules and regulations of being a husband, and also acting more in public alongside his wife, and of course, producing children. But in terms of their relationship, it seems that there is no real royal conception of it in terms of what I mentioned earlier in the introduction about the bedchamber being robbed of its position as the center of royal, the manufacture of royal heirs. Because when talking about Sophie, talking about Ludwig's Elsa, it very much comes to mind this association that this is, like Wagner, a lesser iteration of that connection through the soul, through artistic infatuation. And this is Ludwig himself. You know the nature of my destiny. I once wrote to you from Berg about my mission in the world. You also know that I do not have many years to live. And again, this is another apocalyptic theme running through Ludwig II about his imminent fear of death, his conception of his own mortality. That I shall leave this earth when the unthinkable happens, when my star no longer shines, when he has gone, the truly beloved friend. Yes, then my time will be up, for then I shall no longer be able to live. This in reference to Wagner's death, Wagner, of course, being significantly older than Ludwig. You have always taken such a true, sincere, and heartfelt interest in my fate, dear Sophie, that I shall be deeply thankful to you for it and for the rest of my life. The main basis of our interchange, as you will confirm, has always been the remarkable, sweeping destiny of Richard Wagner. Again, this is not to say that there was purely a romantic, hyperbolic relationship between the two. Ludwig was very much content to use Wagner. For example, he didn't abdicate when essentially he was prepared to when Wagner was forced away to live in Switzerland, also following the disaster of Ludwig's role in the Austro-Prussian War of 1866. Um, Ludwig very much conceived of Wagner as someone to be used in terms of his being able to realize the dream of his grandfather, Ludwig I, in terms of making Munich the cultural center of Germany. Essentially, from Ludwig II's point of view, Munich was to be the cultural engine from which to win around the unification of Germany. While Prussia was prepared to unite Germany through force of arms, Ludwig II will do so through patronage of the arts, which again is why he was obsessed with using a uniform modern equivalent of the German language, a harmonized version of the German language, as opposed to always reducing Bavaria back into a form of parochialism, which again just adds to the irony. If that is Ludwig's intention, if that is why he was prepared to use Wagner, and yet Unsere Knie, the legacy of Ludwig II, being associated with Bavarian exceptionalism within this regard, it elevates Bavaria, but Bavaria fails to be the engine of German unification. Also references you saw from the letter from Posart, and you see it here that Ludwig explicitly makes this association between his star and the star that is fading. Indeed, I am always drawn to the excerpt in Tannhäuser and the essentially the hymn to the evening star. In the case of Ludwig, all of his association is going back essentially to the night, to the star. All this is to add, whereas um, we have the king of the sun. Here we have the king of the star. He is the star, but he is the star glimmering bright in the night. Again, referencing the my emphasis on the title of the Night King. Ludwig had partially restored his standing with the Bavarians after this catastrophe. He had turned out in uniform to encourage the troops on the eve of war with Prussia, looking quite the young hero in his white horse, his long hair flowing free. He would not wear a helmet, for he hated disturbing his coiffure. Indeed, that's one of the weird sort of eccentricity, is excessive vanity and fear of losing his looks, which of course, as you can see in this grandiose painting, which is the new thumbnail for the stream, eventually he did, and he perhaps grew morbidly obese in terms of that identification. But again, the obsession with little things like his hair is just to compound this idea of he is the beautiful prince, he is the heroic archetype, he is the Lohengrin. He is to represent beauty as is also supposed to patronize it. Though the Bavarian army, which had entered the war allied with Austria, was decisively worsted in battle, Bismarck, the Prussian minister-president, later Chancellor of Germany, knew that he might have need of Bavarian support in any future battle with France, and the kingdom was only lightly truncated the peace, a tiny little territory in Franconia. Though Ludwig had done precisely nothing for his country, either at war or at the peace, he took much of the credit, and so great was the relief at his proposal to get married that a lavish state wedding was planned. Sophie seemed to have driven the stake into the heart of the enduring vampire Lola Montes. The fire that burned for Wagner in the heart of Ludwig, however, was not dimmed by Elsa's apparent passion for him too, Elsa, the nickname for Sophie. Ludwig began to doubt how deep that was, and as the marriage grew ever closer, he began to be obsessed by fear of having to maintain the pretense of affection for a woman. Wagner was his true beloved, his friend, his god, and Cosima was his Freundin. That left little space for Sophie. Cosima again being a source of inspiration for him. Cosima, of course, was the mistress and then wife of Richard Wagner, but both members of that party, the couple, maintained an intimate relation with Ludwig, which is why Ludwig found it so painful, essentially, to finally admit their relationship, to the point that he was prepared to, and ultimately did, damage his own reputation by publicly refuting claims of their infidelity, because at this time, Cosima was married to Hans von Bülow, who was now the conductor of the Munich Orchestra, so an integral part of Ludwig's cultural plans. That left little space for Sophie. The wedding was postponed, and when Sophie's father wrote to expostulate Ludwig, he took instant offense. The engagement was off. He could not marry someone who he did not love, and as he was to tell Cosima, it was a performance of Lohengrin that gave him the resolution to break his burdensome fetters. So at one point, we're talking about his unique conception of kingship, that he, unlike, say, for example, the Windsor monarchy, does not feel compelled to follow the form, the writ of monarchy, which is expected of him to marry and to have children. And in terms of his own conception of his lordship and his absolutism over Bavaria, that is really identified in terms of the relationship between his would-be father-in-law, because it is the expostulation, it is the chastisement of Sophie's father that allows Ludwig to claim that he has essentially received lèse-majesté, the idea that Sophie's father can have some sort of claim over his conduct. And all of a sudden, in terms of Ludwig's grandiose, vain conception of himself, it has now become a question of his own political authority. He will not be beholden to the expectations of his future father-in-law. And so there is also a political dynamic which causes him to break with that relationship. The relationship with Wagner, despite the metamorphosis of Cosima as mistress, mother, and now wife, remained the core of Ludwig's emotional life, but it was to be darkened by the shadows of incipient lunacy. And again, incipient lunacy very much in inverted commas. He had attempted to show himself ready to be a public monarch, to marry, and perhaps beget an heir. but he had now begun to withdraw from the world into solitary quiet of his many chateaux. The knowledge that Wagner owned the ring and that Ludwig had promised to present it in its entirety remained uppermost in his mind. For a time, he thought Wagner had no business working on the Meistersingers of Nuremberg until he heard it performed in Munich, and then became a convert to the hymn of German art and culture, this apotheosis of Walter von Vogelwieder's The Dawn of a New Age. But the composer was finding difficulties in getting either the singers of the production that he wanted, and had become disenchanted with the Munich opera, despite its tumultuous welcome to the Meistersingers in 1868. Meanwhile, Cosima's real status in the Wagner seraglio was becoming known. Ludwig gradually realized that his Freundin was in fact an adulteress, and moreover was someone who had been the Lord and his God, like Fricka with the errant Wotan, that being a reference to Rheingold and Die Valkyrie, the, uh, the Lord, the King, and the Queen of the gods. Ludwig felt betrayed by all the lies that had surrounded and what had been convinced that he essentially shared worship of a common deity. The ring, however, had to be performed as promised. Wagner was prevented by Cosima from breaking altogether with Ludwig and trying his fortune in Prussia. But the 1869 first production in Munich of Das Rheingold was beset by problems. Von Bülow had had enough of pretending that nothing was happening to his marriage and been sent off to sick leave to nurse his sense of betrayal. They were replaced by Wagner's other pupil, Hans Richter. Rehearsals were dogged by mechanical failures. One of the Rhine maidens got seasick in what was later to be dubbed the Aquarium of Whores, and Richter fell foul of the management, claiming that he only took orders from Wagner. He was instantly suspended, and despite Wagner's peremptory order that he be restored, Ludwig showed that he was a king and would not be ordered about even by Wagner. Richter was not just suspended, he was sacked for insubordination and contempt of royal authority. Again, this conception of lèse-majesté. Another anecdote comes that, in terms of, again, quote unquote, incipient lunacy, Ludwig could be arbitrarily tyrannical. Once a servant looked into the royal eyes, and again, we talk about the royal sight, the royal glare. To gaze upon the face of a monarch is, in a sense, kind of like gazing upon the face of God. It can be perceived to be a sign of offense to majesty. And so Ludwig II has one of these servants beaten mercilessly, just to again talk about the lengths he would go in terms of sustaining this idea of protecting his royal person. Das Rheingold was finally performed in Munich in 1869, the Rhine maidens happily earthbound in the wings, despite Wagner's plea to wait until he had completed the ring before performing it. The performance was not one that either Ludwig or Wagner had desired. Everything seemed to go off half-cock, and Ludwig tried to make the peace by reiterating that his mission was to serve the maestro, the master. He wrote a grovelling letter of submission, vowing that a rupture could only end in Ludwig's suicide, the constant theme of death and imminent mortality. What was the value of a crown compared to a friendly letter from Wagner? Wagner's reply ended abruptly. Either the king wanted Wagner's works performed, as he, Wagner, or he did not. Ludwig could not wait. In 1870, he ordered Die Valkyrie to be performed, as was his right since he owned the score. Wagner insisted on controlling the performance, or we had nothing to do with it. He had nothing to do with it. It was premiered in Munich by local talent, Brahms, Saint-Saëns, Liszt, and were in the audience, but neither Wagner, nor as it happened, Ludwig. It was a resounding success, and lavish, with real horses from the royal stables carrying grooms disguised as warrior maidens, but it constituted a final break with Wagner, who now planned to perform the ring elsewhere. So Ludwig very consciously desired to have Wagner in Munich. But Wagner, again, both of them were essentially competing over their cultural destinies. Ludwig wanted to add Wagner to his star, whereas Wagner was anxious to create his own separate site of pilgrimage, and he does so in Bayreuth. Bayreuth, which effectively is midway between Munich and the new German capital of Berlin, and was, of course, in staunchly Protestant Franconia, although part of Ludwig II's domain, as opposed to devoutly Catholic Bavaria proper. All of this is again to show that Wagner and Ludwig's relationship was not that of this undying friendship, but that of bitter rivalry in terms of trying to control the other, like again jilted lovers in many senses, but in a spiritual sense, in a sense of friendship rather than in terms of a literal romance. And of course, Wagner wins. The 1876 premiere of The Ring happens in Bayreuth. All of the princes of Germany, foreign visitors, even the Kaiser join there. Ludwig has the consolation of a private performance there. But of course, so much of this is paid personally by Ludwig, and Ludwig even pays for the new residence of Wagner in Bayreuth, Wahnfried, where his Wagner's delusions find rest. Indeed, I think focusing on the name Wahnfried, in many ways, it also encapsulates the relationship between Ludwig and Wagner. The idea that this is all abounding delusions, going again back to so incessant to use this engraving by Gustave Doré, a world full of abstractions, crowding the imagination, where my delusions find rest. If Wahnfried were to exist in Bayreuth, then Ludwig II would spend the next sort of decade of his reign trying to find his own Wahnfried, where his delusions would find rest. And of course, ultimately, his personality and his mission is ceaseless, and it would die, as ultimately he prophesied 20 years early, in tragedy, focused always on his imminent death and of his fate being associated with the continued life of the maestro, of the master, of Richard Wagner. But that's just one aspect of Ludwig. It's the most touted aspect of Ludwig in many senses, that in the construction of his castles. For obvious reasons. Richard Wagner is perhaps the greatest composer of German opera, and is a integral force in terms of being able to understand the unification of Germany from a cultural point of view. But Ludwig also had a very specific political schema. And even though this can at times delve into counterfactuals, nevertheless, I think it is imperative that we understand that Ludwig is not simply an extension of Wagner. Rather, they are two formidable personalities involved in a tumultuous whirlwind relationship. So Ludwig ascends to the throne unexpectedly at the age of 18, and of the death of his father Maximilian. Maximilian, who was considered a very prudent, effective monarch, who was concerned about Bavaria's place within the scheme of the German Confederation, uh, over the idea of nascent idea of Germany being formed under whom, because in 1848 it wasn't just the fact that Lola Montez had been instrumental in terms of chasing Frederick I from the throne, and the memory of Lola Montez comes back to haunt the association between Ludwig and Wagner. But it was a revolution of German nationalism. In 1848, 1849, we have the Frankfurt Parliament in Germany, and it's possible that Bavaria may have been subsumed into a liberal democratic German constitution under the headship of then Prussian King Frederick Wilhelm. So you can say that Ludwig's reign can be divided into two distinct parts. The first reign has the consideration, the foreign policy consideration over German unification, and indeed a strained emulation and a desire to complete the legacy of his grandfather, Ludwig's grandfather, Ludwig I. And then there is the second reign, the shadow reign, the king in search of a refuge of inner reification, sanctification, and buildings. But there is a deeply political conception, a hard political conception to Ludwig's vision, which go beyond these more lofty aspirations or offences taken by his own conception of lèse-majesté. This is a segment taken from Ludwig II by Spangenberg, which, in contrast to McIntosh's biography, is less of a conventional biography. It's rather prosaic. In many ways, it's a very useful textbook for understanding Ludwig. I would say that this, if you're sort of more familiar with the history, this can be some sort of intermediate guide in terms of understanding his reign. Bavaria owed its status as kingdom to the self-proclaimed emperor of the French, Napoleon I, who in 1806 raised the allies of Baden, Bavaria, Württemberg, and Saxony by 1 degree to that of kingdom. Thus, Bavaria was a revolutionary social climber, from the Corsican aristocracy of all people who turned the electorate into a kingdom. Elector Maximilian Joseph became King Maximilian I. and one of the freshly crowned king's daughters was given to Napoleon as a bride for his stepson, Eugene de Beauharnais. This was the Bonaparte's family's first link with an old aristocratic dynasty. The House of Wittelsbach had ruled Bavaria since 1180, so before the famous marriage of Mary Louise and the alliance between the Habsburgs and the Bonapartes, first there were the Wittelsbachs. So great was their connection essentially to France. Ludwig's great-grandfather, Max Joseph, came from a branch of the Wittelsbach family from the Palatinate. The male line Bavarian side of the family had died in 1777. Within 2 decades of his ascension, not only had the entire structure of the state and the monarch status within it changed, the very territory of Bavaria itself was altered. The final results of this development was a country whose borders have remained well nigh unchanged to this day, with the exception of the Relish Palatinate, which is the large section you can see on the left side of this map, which was an important factor in terms of understanding German unification, which was given to Bavaria in 1816. However, with no direct land connection with the rest of Bavaria and strongly influenced by its time under French occupation, the Palatinate's position remained an exceptional one in many respects until it was incorporated into the new German federal state as Rhineland-Palatinate in 1946. The young kingdom of Bavaria gained several further territories in Franconia and Swabia. The years 1803, 6, 10, and 16 marked the gradual emergence of a state whose parts differed significantly in terms of their culture, economy, social structure, and religion. According to the role of monarch as a figurehead and unifying figure integrating all of his subjects and all of the country's parts was an important one. The Bavarian kings sought to meet this challenge in different ways. For Ludwig II, it was to become one of the greatest problems. So it's not just the elevation of the electorate to the kingdom, but the kingdom itself is a radically new conception of what Bavarian rulership even means, because you are more than simply the ruler of Bavaria. You are now the ruler of Bavaria, parts of Swabia, and a large part of Franconia as well. One of the largest principalities within Germany, the height of what Cavaliero refers to as the Grand Pumpernickel. Indeed, you can say it's the inverse of it. If Pumpernickel is to refer to a state, we can refer to it as the state of the Reuss dynasty, or one of these smaller principalities that would effectively be gobbled up by Prussia during the Seven Weeks' War. Bavaria was a real kingdom. It was on the scale of larger than the Belgium or the Netherlands, etc. It wasn't just some other petty German fiefdom. On the 1st of January 1806, the Bavarian imperial heraldry rode through the streets of Munich, officially and ceremonially proclaiming the king and kingdom of Bavaria to its citizens, and soon afterwards, Bavaria joined the Confederation of the Rhine under Napoleon I. 9 years later, after Napoleon's defeat in the Congress of Vienna, Bavaria had become a member of the German Confederation, and was thus an autonomous, independent, and above all equal member of this association of Central European states. The Confederation collapsed during the reign of Ludwig II and was replaced by the German Reich, into which Bavaria was integrated, losing this status. Initially, Bavaria changed only little, remaining a predominantly rural and agricultural country, its landscape shaped by fields, meadows, and vineyards. Farmers made up well over half of the population. Around 70% of Bavarians were Roman Catholic, as was the ruling family. Coal, iron ore imports, from which mainly came from Prussia, were needed to drive the beginnings of industrialization. Overall, Bavaria was largely dependent on the major powers of Austria and Prussia and their politics in its attempt to shape its future. You can also see that by the political geography, by just looking at the map, but also emphasis on the trade relationship with Prussia. We talk about aspects such as the Zollverein, but you can say that unification and Bavaria's dependence on Prussia, that the ultimate form of subjugation is driven by far more materialistic concerns. Bavaria was a constitutional monarchy. The first Bavarian constitution was created in 1808, only to be replaced by another one in 1818. Within this monarchy, Ludwig II, as head of state, united all sovereign powers in his person. At the same time, he was bound by the ministries of his own appointing, by parliament, and just like his subjects, by a constitution. Ludwig II was not an absolute monarch. This mundane contrast with his poetic ideal of kingship by divine right was heightened by the fact that in reality the ministers determined policies, even though they were appointed by the king and by him alone. So again, very much mirroring what we have in Prussia. This gradual development had begun under Maximilian Joseph, who had already accepted that his power was curtailed by his most important minister, Maximilian of Monteglas, who took over some of the king's tasks. While Maximilian's son and successor Ludwig I was significantly more autocratic, he was unable to reverse the power relations now defined by the constitution, and this ultimately was resolved by the revolution. The weight of the minister's work was encouraged by Ludwig's son Maximilian II and his style of leadership. The ministers and officials increasingly understood themselves as the chief bearers of state power and saw their role as advisors to the king of only a secondary importance. This was the situation in which Ludwig succeeded his father's throne. So effectively, from the point of view of people like Fichtemeister and Vorden, who are prominent ministers of Ludwig II, theirs is a position of ultimate custodianship, and the king is a supplemental factor. Effectively, the managerial state has circumvented the power of royal majesty. This effectively is a system that Ludwig II found not only shackling, but ultimately you can say it led to his demise. The main question was now how the king could use the power still available to him, and indeed whether he wanted to, and what strength and energy he was able to muster as head of state to control the events of his country and assert himself against his ministers. He was able to set state guidelines according to his own personal ideas. Laws only came into force after being signed by him and countersigned by the co-responsible minister. However, the issue which was ultimately to shape and define these laws, they were ultimately implemented by a bureaucracy that increasingly gained momentum of its own. And this momentum had a key influence on the effect on any regulation. Despite ministers' own self-confidence, they remained dependent on the trust of the monarch who appointed and dismissed them. The parliament and its majorities played hardly any role in the appointment of ministers. Parliament was made up of two houses, a first house of councillors, its members being royal princes, the crown, the Archbishop of Munich, Freising, Bamberg, etc., and a house of representatives who were elected. The latter exercised but little authority in Bavaria's constitutional monarchy. There were two most important rights were to set the budget and to take part in the legislative procedure, emphasis on the significance of the budget. During his reign, Ludwig II appointed ministers exclusively from the liberal faction, even though they were in a minority in the second house from 1869 onwards. Accordingly, Bavarian politics were determined by a liberal elite determined to preserve the structure of the state. One institution held an important function that the constitution had not envisaged, at least not in the form it came to take. This was the cabinet secretariat, which served as an intermediary between the king and the government and thus played a key role. Under Ludwig II, its leader, who managed the king's personal affairs towards the public and was even able to influence political matters between the monarch and his ministers, who was always a member of the liberal elite, this made it possible to cooperate smoothly with the ministers, something that was to become very important following Ludwig's withdrawal from his role as Bavarian head of state and unifying figurehead. The cabinet secretary was the only official who was able to see the king regularly, and thus, at least in principle, he had the opportunity to influence him. The new king, Ludwig II, had to act and perform his official duties within this incredibly complex system of government, made up by a monarch, ministry, cabinet secretary, and parliament. For someone inexperienced in the government, there was nothing to be gained by his poetic ideal, especially if history held in store tasks that would have posed a significant challenge to anyone in this position. Even though he knew nothing of this at the time of his ascension, Ludwig declared, "Great and heavy is the task appointed to me," he continued. "I rely on God to send me the light and the strength I require to fulfill it." Emphasis again, divine right, and this idea of the reality of what it means to be a Bavarian monarch. And again, just emphasize that the whole Bavarian monarchy is a contrivance. When Leopold I is trying to return to a more autocratic form of government. Indeed, you can say the most foremost exponent of trying to import old pre-revolutionary French forms of government, of course, includes the importation of a maîtresse en titre, his own Madame de Pompadour, albeit an Irish version in the form of Lola Montez. All of this is to say that Bavarian kingship harkens back to a medieval legacy, and just in terms of how significant Bavaria was, um, obviously we mentioned that the main house of Wittelsbach died in 1777, but in 1745, a member of the House of Wittelsbach was an emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. They had temporarily wrested that control from Austria during the War of Austrian Succession. So all of this again is to say that we have a Bavarian modern monarchy, a constitutional setup influenced by a liberal minister under Maximilian I Montgelas, who wanted to draw Bavaria into the orbit of France and revolutionary France at that. And then, in the height of Romanticism in Germany, we have that contrasted with this idea of an ancient, enduring state that goes all the way back to the 12th century, which has sired emperors of the Holy Roman Empire and has grand ambitions to unite all of Germany. And of course, Wagner understands this very well. It's not enough simply to have a financial patron, a cultural patron, a soulmate, and a friend, but he has essentially to help Ludwig in this. Because Fiftemeister goes off and tries to find Wagner, Wagner is fleeing from his creditors, and he is in many senses rescued, very literally, by Ludwig. As Wagner is one of the first figures into Ludwig's new entourage, and as Ludwig essentially is quarantined within this whole system of the cabinet secretariat, having a royal favorite, like a second Lola Montez, can have a huge influence over the political direction of the rest of Bavarian history, essentially. The way in which Wagner knew, so this is going back to McIntosh, the way in which Wagner knew how to speak Ludwig's innermost conviction is shown by the essay on state and religion, which the composer wrote at the king's request, while the latter was away at the spa town of Kissingen, Bavaria, meeting an assemblage of royalty, including the Emperor of and Empress of Austria, the Tsar and Tsarina of Russia, and the heir to the throne of Württemberg. This essay of Wagner's beliefs belies the widely held view that Wagner was a muddle thinker and writer when he strayed outside of music and drama. It is somewhat bizarre, but brilliantly argued analysis of the nature of kingship and its relation to religion and art. For the following summary, McIntosh relies on the works of W.A. Willis. Wagner begins by emphasizing the exalted mission of the monarch. In no state, he writes, is there a loftier law than which centers its stability in the supreme hereditary power of one particular family. In the person of the king, the state attains its true ideal. The role of the king, Wagner goes on to say, is essentially a tragic one, since he is called on to strive for such irreconcilable ideals as justice and humanity. Because of this, it is given to the king more than to any ordinary citizen to feel that in man there dwells an infinitely deeper, more capacious need than the state and its ideal can ever satisfy. It is religion alone that can bear the king to a stricter dignity of manhood. The religious eye, Wagner argues, perceives that there must be another world above the everyday, one in which strife and rivalries. For this, the essence of true religion, that away from the cheating show of the day-tide world, it shines in the night of man's innermost heart, with a light quite other than the world's sunlight, and visible nowhere save out of the depth. The king then stands at the point where state religion meet, yet an irrecusable urge to turn his back completely on this world must necessarily surge up within his breast, where not need for him. Not as the common man, a certain distraction, a periodical turning aside from the world's earnestness which else is present in his thoughts. This certain distraction is, Wagner says, provided by art, and he continues in conclusion, I therefore point my highly lovingly young friend in art as the kindly life saviour who does not really and wholly lead us out beyond this life, but within it, lifts up above it, and shows itself as a game of play in its most rapt beholding of this. There will return to him the invincible dream picture of the holiest revolution. So what are we talking about when we really refer to the religious eye? Well, Wagner is influenced by Schopenhauer, and Schopenhauer is obviously a pessimist and sees much futility in everything. Germany and the romantic ideal is moving beyond the strict sort of subsets of religion. Ludwig II is by inheritance, he is a Catholic, but he has a very particular conception of what it means to be a Catholic and how that contrasts with his role of being a king. One of his positions, which I'll elaborate in greater detail, is the idea of him being anti-ultramonarchist. But a religious eye can mean many things. In Wagner's conception, the religious eye is aspiring to the realm of forms. It's almost Platonic, but it's looking specifically at what the king can achieve in the realm of art, and that all else is a distraction. That the king shouldn't be simply confined on the mundane sort of realities, and shouldn't be beset by rivalries. And again, that's a very archaic and grandiose conception of Christian kingship, which is the king can never represent faction. The king must stand apart and represent all of his kingdom of Bavaria, regardless of faction. And that, within the specific Bavarian royal context, chimes well with this idea that the king is a patron to Protestants and he is a patron to Catholics. Indeed, you have to also understand that Wagner was only a few years before this an anti-royal revolutionary. He was exiled from Germany for his part in the revolutions in Saxony in 1849. He'd been banished from Germany, and part of Wagner's grand entrance and salvation to Munich is also part of his political reconciliation, one that, of course, is undermined by this unhappy association with him as the second Lola Montes. So the holiest revolution, as Wagner expounds in his essay, could be the revelation of Wagner himself coming to rescue the monarchy as some form of warrior, political prophet, musician, sorcerer, rather than looking at this as simply going to the realm of forms or looking to Christian monarchy or religion. All of these elements, you can say, are infused in Wagner's conception. And indeed, you can say that the befuddlement and the multifaceted conception of Wagner and his evolving understanding of politics and kingship, if I'm going to be really cynical, you can look at all this and basically say that this is an act of supreme sycophancy in terms of simply telling Ludwig what he wants to hear, how much this belies Wagner's true interpretation of politics within this sense. But the emphasis again is on the aspirations for a form of real monarchy, of religious eye, which can be interpreted as divine right, which aspires beyond the mundane realities of being a constitutional monarch and being beholden by things such as budgets and legislation and ministerial appointments and liaisons with cabinet secretaries, etc., etc., etc. This essay is more than just a general treatise of monarchy, religion, and art. It was written for Ludwig himself in mind and was intended to help him come to terms with his own dilemmas and conflicts by giving him a philosophical viewpoint that will bring the contemplative side of his life in harmony with the requirements of his kingship. Wagner saw clearly that without some powerful unifying vision, these two sides would drift apart. He also knew that such vision would involve his own work. Inevitably, therefore, Wagner's influence over Ludwig went far beyond the fields of the arts, there emphasizing the mystical bond between them. And again, if we're looking at Ludwig as some grandiose German inner cultural imperialist, then the association with his kingship and the furtherance of the arts would seem to go hand in hand. And indeed, Ludwig, for his part, goes beyond Wagner in terms of understanding this, in terms of his patronage of figures such as Schiller, and trying to represent some sort of pan-German cultural renaissance centered in Munich, emulating his royal forebear in the form of Frederick I. Wagner essentially is a prophet, but Wagner is not going to be the cult god of some form of Ludwigian deification of this new regime. No, Wagner is an indispensable asset to this. He is a cultural, he is a spiritual, and he's a political confidant. But for Ludwig II, effectively, that's how far it goes in terms of his own political scheming. So just to buttress this point, just bear with me, so many segments and quotes here. This is going back to Schiller, as I mentioned, but specifically Schiller's William Tell. Ludwig had a passion for theatre, which equaled, if not in many ways, sort of was the companion to his passion in opera. A special train, which Ludwig had designed, conveyed Ludwig from Berg Castle to Munich and back again for his theatrical evenings, and often his ministers had to confer with him at the door of his box during intervals. After the performance of William Tell, Ludwig decided to see for himself the country for which Tell had fought. Ludwig's abiding passion for Switzerland, the land of democracy par excellence, this being the case of the Canton system and Swiss devolution, might seem at first sight paradoxical for a traditionally minded king, but Ludwig's concept of kingship was a rather special one, and was influenced by Wagner's theories. What appealed to Wagner and to Ludwig was the idea of a monarch or leader in whom power was vested by virtue of the trust placed in him by the people, the folk. Whether the leader is chosen because of his blood or for some other reason is not important, even though in Wagner's own conception there is a high-minded, grandiose conception of the Wittelsbach dynasty. Again, how sincere Wagner was in that, we don't really know. But again, the idea of the blood, the land, the folk, German nationalism, all of these things would be conducive to one another. What matters is the deeply felt mystical bond between the king and people. It was the principle which Ludwig saw at work in the story of William Tell, William Tell being the grand sort of embodiment of Swiss nationalism against Austrian imperialism. And admired bond of confidence that existed between Tell and the people, the Swiss he represented. This is why Ludwig had little use for either politicians, the progressive liberal kind, or for those of the arch-monarchist conservative persuasion. Both interposed themselves between the king and his people and interfered with his almost priestly function as leader and hero. So we're talking about a conception of monarchy which is anti-political in the sense that it dispenses with politicians, and yet Ludwig is virtually dependent on politicians, given, like I said, his second reign, the Shadow King, his refuge, his desire to retreat from the world and build his palaces. He is at once a slave to the bureaucracy, yet he sees his role as being beyond managerialism, being beyond the bureaucrats, speaking in harmony to his people. Despite the fact he is so lonely and a recluse, he will avoid all human contact, act as a tyrant to his entourage, and will not show himself and do things that the people expect of him, such as in the obvious instance, getting rid of Richard Wagner, which would be contrary to these two aspects, but also in doing things such as being married, which would have been a brilliant way of reconciling him with a increasingly sort of perturbed and confused population. Indeed, when we go back to this uh, posthumous legacy of Ludwig as Unser Akini, it can only really exist posthumously as the king was so remote in his life. But that also adds to the whole mystique of the king. Because he is physically remote, he is also transcending into this other space which Wagner is talking about, the identification of divine right monarchy. But we have the idea of a people, the king's connection with the people. Obviously, Bavarian nationalists are going to take that as being the people of Bavaria. But what about the people of Germany, as I've referenced many times? This is a segment from Werner Richter's biography of Ludwig, and this is Werner Richter's own speculation. At the time, the king, who was still young, began once more to hope, and this explains his elated mood in which he found himself. Already there were clear indications in the air that this war, if it turned out well, referring to the Austro-Prussian War, the 7 Weeks' War, could only end in the new German unification. This could also reference the Franco-Prussian War, a unification for which no form was conceivable other than the time-honored imperial one, Holy Roman Empire, and this supreme and historic office, unforgotten and charged with a mystical radiance, would surely thereby be accessible also to Ludwig's ancient dynasty, the Wittelsbachs, from whom more than one emperor had been drawn. Had not Wagner called him the potent embodiment of the German folk spirit, and had not Cornelius, after the first meeting with the king, silently dubbed him Emperor of Germany? That is the idea. And I believe if you read enough into Ludwig and also understand his language policy and Wagner's influence over Ludwig, it is obvious that he had so much in terms of knowledge, original ideas, but he could not exercise this power, this volition, this will personally, owing to his own lack of leadership ability, political canniness, and a concrete vision. In this case, Bismarck, the German minister president, completely eclipses Ludwig. Indeed, it would have been impossible for Ludwig to have realized these ambitions against Bismarck without a minister on Bavaria's side who also shared his vision of the equivalent, say, for example, of von Schwarzenberg. Because even in the case of Austria, when looking at figures like Van Beust and before him von Bach, these two figures failed Austria. So what hope essentially did Ludwig have? Maximilian's own idea, Ludwig's father, was to see Bavaria as the leader of the little states in Germany, a little Germany, which could have excluded Prussia and also excluded Austria. Austria, before the Austro-Prussian War in 1866, was seen as the dominant member, the president of the German Confederation. But after 1866 and the creation of the German North Confederation, all the energy, all the momentum for German unification lay with Prussia. And the final act of that was the creation of the conditions for war with France and the proclamation of the German Empire in the Palace of Versailles. Interesting enough, going back to the connotations with Louis XIV. Um, so there is a lot of irony in the sense that Ludwig II is being robbed from something of which he may have earnestly aspired to by the infinitely superior politicking of Bismarck, who was prepared to use force. Ludwig II effectively was a pacifist. Ludwig II was compelled to go to war in 1866 against his will. And it was during that time that he was basically absent without leave. He basically deserted his army and only very begrudgingly made token gestures in terms of support. Um, it was very difficult, say, for example, to even organize the general mobilization. And when Bavarian troops engaged with the Prussians, they did disastrously. And like I said, it was all part of Bismarck's largesse. The same with Austria, by the way, which prevented large-scale annexations, like we see with the Kingdom of Hanover in the north, which was entirely annexed by Prussia, now the North German Confederation. So how can you essentially act as this pacifist trying to dominate Germany culturally? If you can't do it diplomatically either, then there's really no aspiration for it. So once Ludwig essentially comes to the realization of the inevitability of a new recoalescing of the Holy Roman Empire, albeit under the rule of the Hohenzollerns, who are the Prussian dynasty effectively. Ludwig II is the pacifist turned to this sort of deep um, search for the cultural reification. And indeed, just in terms of illustrating this extent of pacifism, the only death he seemed to long for was his own death. The only death he would countenance is that of his own suicide. He had a painful, almost sort of a moral repugnance for the death penalty. In this wasn't sort of so uncommon. I mean, in the 18th century, many quote unquote enlightened monarchs, even the Empress Elizabeth, the Tsarina of Russia, forbade the use of the death penalty. But in the case of Ludwig, it just shows to say the massive gulf in the perception between the Prussian mode of German unification and the Ludwigian mode. But Ludwig still had many cards to play when Germany, the German states, went to war with France, because Bavaria was not a dependent yet. Bavaria was essentially a lesser ally within the German alliance structure. The fact that the French had declared war on Prussia and not vice versa meant that Bavaria was essentially obligated by treaty to join sides as part of a defensive alliance with Prussia. But and that was, of course, part of Bismarck's genius to contrive that diplomatic situation to bring Bavaria on board. But Bavaria effectively could have acted as the leader of the southern German states. In fact, there could have been the creation of a southern German confederation to mirror that of Prussia. But as I said, Ludwig II was dependent in many ways on his ministers, despite all of his affectations of his poetic ideals to circumvent them, because many of his ministers were more liberal and they wanted to join in Prussia for the economic advantages. Many of them were politically liberal. They were bound to this idea of German nationalism, but they weren't, and they also wanted political opportunities such as that would later afford themselves in the German Empire. So, for example, the third Chancellor of Germany was in fact a Bavarian and a former minister of Ludwig II. All of this is to say that Ludwig's own ministers were in many ways content with this scenario. Ludwig II didn't have the backing of a strong monarchist or sovereigntist core to be able to oppose this. And in terms of just contriving a way of Ludwig II being elevated within this new German Empire, there was floated this idea that the office of the German emperor, the German Kaiser, would not be hereditary. It would be elective, or it would alternate. In other words, when King Wilhelm, now Emperor Wilhelm of Prussia, died, it will be Ludwig II who comes and succeeds. And that way you have the alliance with the southern states and the alliance with the northern states in order to make it a truly German monarchy, that you have one monarch from the north and one monarch from the south. But of course, given all of the political indications, effectively, uh, that was impossible, even though it was brought about at a time. And again, it would be interesting to see the trajectory of German history had that happened. Indeed, from all of these lofty aspirations, it is Ludwig, as the leader of the small German princes, who essentially offers up the crown of German unification to Wilhelm I. It is Ludwig specifically. And he does so partly as a way of ensuring that Bavaria is given pride of place, and indeed it does. Bavaria keeps its own army within the German Confederation. Bavaria effectively remains an allied, though dependent state on the German Reich, and even during World War One, Bavaria effectively is under the command of its new king, Leopold III, in alliance with the German Kaiser, who is also the Prussian king, rather than simply as dependent. So all of those stipulations, you can say, are as a result of Ludwig proactively deciding to offer the crown of German unification, of German emperor, to the Prussian king. But there's also a far more earthly reason as to why he did that, which, in terms of coming back to the construction of his castles, he wanted money. He wanted money to fund Linderhof and Herrenchiemsee and Neuschwanstein. He had already, after 1869, when very much it seemed that between Wagner and Ludwig would never sort of come to terms and rekindle that relationship they had in 1864, 1865, that Ludwig was instead focused on his fantastical projects. All of this is essentially to say that Ludwig II, despite all of his aspirations, has either the benefit or the blame in furthering the aspirations for the consolidation of Hohenzollern, Prussian, German Imperium. Um, so, yes, I mean, in terms of how things could have gone differently, Ludwig could not turn the tide of managerialism to his advantage. Wilhelm I, of course, had the great minister in Bismarck. There was no Bavarian minister of talent to understand and translate Ludwig's wishes into political action. Ludwig had very poor political instincts, and he surrounded himself with degenerates and corrupt people like Hesselschredt and Holstein, and various political opponents like Holo Schillingfurs. Schillingfurs, the man who would become the third Chancellor of Germany after von Caprivi. It was nearly an impossible task, given the fact that Austria, of course, was also failed. Ironically, Ludwig's greatest political adversary, Bismarck, was the closest, I believe, in terms of understanding Ludwig. You can come back to comparisons between the age of Monteglas in the reign of Maximilian I and the age of Ludwig. In this case, it would have been exploiting the power of France to allow for Bavaria's aggrandizement. So even in the legacy of powerful Bavarian ministers, it is Bavaria riding the coattails of more powerful nations in terms of making themselves stronger. So maybe that is what's going through Ludwig's mind in joining in Prussia to form an alliance as leader of the South German Confederation. Yes, Bavaria does very well out of allying with Prussia vis-a-vis the other German states, Hanover being the worst affected, but not really as well as perhaps Ludwig II had hoped. And yes, I mean, obviously Wagner as God, Ludwig being the peak, the summit of German Romanticism, it all goes back to this whole notion of the state and power being above temporal concerns. Wagner ultimately was a political liability. Wagner was going to confer on Ludwig the idea of the spiritual leader of the Horde being the primordial term for German unification, going back to the era of the original Nibelungenlied. And yet Wagner is tinged with Protestant social democratic rhetoric. And of course, Ludwig, of course, saw himself as anti-political in the sense that he was anti-politicians. So Wagner definitely couldn't fulfill a role that, say, for example, Bismarck fulfilled for Wilhelm I, nor did he unconditionally offer Ludwig II all of his talents and abilities to place at his disposal. Again, this interesting idea of the alternating rulership, which is Yes, and someone else is saying in the chat, sounds similar to Charles VII of Bavaria, who was relying on Louis XV to be propped up. Yes, Maximilian I did the same. He was propped up and made king of Bavaria in the same way that Charles VII believed that by allying with France, he could artificially prop up his influence within Germany. And of course, what does Ludwig do? He declares war on France. Or rather, he joins sides with the Prussians in their war with France. And the only sort of subtle rebellion that Ludwig II has in terms of his opposition is to sign the mobilization orders in French. But even then, as we see, that itself is not really surprising given the francophile nature of the Bavarian court. So, how do we see Ludwig in terms of going back to the medieval aspirations of his father? Well, obviously, people with the channel are going to berate me for using this word again, but you can see Ludwig as a Ghibelline. He is an emperor. He is a Bourbon dynastic reincarnation, the successor of Louis the Bavarian, his ancestor, rather than the mere monarch of Bavaria, this little Unzurakini, our monarch. Um, there's this penchant for French, disdain for Bavarian dialect, and you can go back all the way to medieval periods of Innocent III, Boniface VIII, Dante, the two sons theory. You know, his conception of royal power was such that he opposed the First Vatican Council. He opposed ultramonarchism. He opposed the ultra-Catholic faction within his court because he believed it fundamentally undermined his position as king. So he saw his own secular power as being superior effectively to that of the Pope and his supposed sort of overweening authority within this regard. Ludwig was a unique Bavarian sovereign. He would not countenance a form of vassalage, despite the fact that Bavaria's history had been a form of vassalage, and therefore the vassalage to the Habsburgs, vassalage to France, to Napoleon, and now finally to the Hohenzollerns. You can say his Bavaria is acting in the completely conventional historical arc as it has always acted before. There is a constitutional dubious origin to the Bavarian monarchy, and Ludwig II, you can say, is desperately acting to compensate for this lack of authenticity if Bavaria is supposed to represent an authentic monarch. You can say that we're looking for a historical comparison. I look at Ludwig II not really as an analogy to his ancestor Louis the Ghibelline, Louis the Bavarian, but perhaps a far less successful, complete failure version of Maximilian I, Habsburg, Holy Roman Emperor, a man who very consciously wanted to style his life on the Cervantes Don Quixote mold, with these fanciful, elaborated autobiographies such as Treuerdank and the Weiße König, the White King. Maximilian I even had his court in the mountains in Tyrol, which was recently given over to Bavaria at the height of its alliance with France. So Tyrol, that capital with Innsbruck, had only recently been part of the Kingdom of Bavaria before Franconia was later added. So Maximilian I is this great Holy Roman Empire who's introducing Reichsreform. He wants to bring about a form of medieval unification of the empire, but not explicitly that of a German nation. He is a great patron of the arts, of Jura. He sees himself as the archetypal sort of knight, although not explicitly the Swan knight as in Lohengrin, with his artistic court in the mountains. But of course, when Maximilian I succeeds, Ludwig fails. Ludwig has the consolation to history, to the forms of artistic, the religious eye, to the realm of forms and artistic immortality of having patronized Wagner, in the same way that Maximilian I is perhaps inflated in the historical record. And the reason he's not completely eclipsed by Charles V is because Maximilian is the most famous patron of Dürer, the great German artist at the turn of the 16th century. So in spite of all of this, what is Ludwig's consolation other than art for this? He sends off one of his officials to attempt to purchase a kingdom for his own, a new kingdom in Kabul, in Afghanistan. There are many reasons as to why he wants to do this. One of Wagner's purported operas, which was actually agreed in part of the original uh, how do I describe it? The original um, not schedule, the original program for the operas to take place across the 1860s was to include Parsifal, which wasn't completed until the 1880s, and Die Siegers, the victors. As you can say, Lohengrin and Parsifal could have formed part of their own triune opera set, the idea of the Siegers was going back to a Grail kingdom and the origins of Aryan civilization, because of course Wagner was reading de Gobineau, and the Aryan civilization in India, the idea that Parsifal, Lohengrin, all indebted to this idea of a Grail kingdom. So Ludwig was looking to the Siegers, he was looking to the Grail kingdom in Afghanistan. Um, but it's interesting, isn't it, that 2 years after Ludwig's death, Rudyard Kipling writes the story "The Man Who Would Be King," which is of two British soldiers defecting and wanting to form their own kingdom in Kafiristan. I wonder to what extent Rudyard Kipling was actually inspired by Ludwig for wanting to do the same thing, the man who would be king in Afghanistan or Kafiristan. And another reason, a less lofty, idealistic reason as to why Ludwig II, is the idea that this little patch of land between Russia and India would give him the ability to rule as an absolute monarch in the way he could never rule as an absolute monarch in Bavaria. So his pursuit of absolutism, this ideal of transcending dominion of politicians and of managers, means that Ludwig II is even prepared to forswear his kingdom in Bavaria and buy a little mountain, a little sort of a Talibanesque dwelling where he can live out his fantasy as an absolute monarch, as far as ridiculous and fanciful as it was in Rudyard Kipling's book. Hence, a different form of kingship. So now, going beyond the political ideas of Ludwig and how ultimately all his schemes ended in complete disaster, we come to the coup de grace. We come to the castles themselves. And this is reading from Spangenberg. Oh, it is necessary to create such paradises, with poetic places of refuge, where for a brief time one can forget the dreadful world in which we live, Ludwig wrote to Sibella for Leonard in January of 1869, expressing a creed that he turned into reality through his planning and building of castles. Ludwig's journeyman pieces in Hohenschwangau and Munich had already been mentioned. So Hohenschwangau and Berg Castle, and these were basically the inheritances of Maximilian as well. Of course, Ludwig had many castles, the inheritance essentially of over 100 years of Bavarian rulers very much investing themselves in the arts, not just in Munich, but all across his domains, even, it should be mentioned, in Bayreuth. These journeyman pieces, again, is a subtle reference, I think, to the apprentice works of Wagner. The fact that Wagner himself was willing to get rid of De Liebesverbot and Rienzi from the official Wagner canon of operas. His living quarters in the Munich residence, which was splendidly furnished in the French Baroque style, were only a starting point for Linderhof and Herrenchiemsee. In order to escape from wearisome life, from the restraints of vexing, never-ending monotony of court ceremony that constrained him in the splendid chambers of the temple of the king in Versailles, Louis XIV built a pleasure palace of Trianon. When this too grew and became palace-like, he erected the lonely, modest Marly, so he could breathe freely, and once more, after the exertions of ceremonial life, I would also like to have a small pavilion built near Linderhof. With these lines, in November of 1868, Ludwig gave his councillor, Lorenz von Duflep, the order to construct a palace in the style and the honour of the French king. Initially, his plans were modest, but by 1873, no less than 17 plans with layouts, front views, and interior views had been produced to fulfill Ludwig's desire for his own castle in the mountains. The mountains, again, I go back to this explicit association with Maximilian. And indeed, obviously, people have drawn this as the precursor to the Hitlerian mountain idyll in the Berghof. Ludwig had known since childhood and secluded estate of Linderhof in the Graswang Valley near the Oberammergau, which was selected as the location where these dreams were to become reality. His father had taken up residence on the plain, the King's Little House, built in the style of a traditional Alpine farmhouse. Ludwig took over this house when he became king and was equally fond of spending time there. Again, a weird comparison you can draw between Louis XIV is that Versailles was explicitly picked as his father's hunting lodge, that being of Louis XIII. Over the course of several years, Ludwig's plans for his palace went from building with only one wing to a complex of 5 wings, a chapel and a theatre, seemingly a copy of its model Versailles in any case. The projected palace was now far too large to be built in the narrow mountain valley near Linderhof. As this problem started to become more evident in the summer of 1870, Ludwig wanted to experience at least a small piece of French splendor outside of his Munich apartment. He gave orders for his Königsschauchen, already standing in Linderhof, to be extended. Over the years, this simple refuge had transformed into a large villa with a bedroom, dining room, and study, as well as 4 corner rooms, all decorated in the Rococo style. Franz Seitz, set designer and director of the Court Theatre, and a stage painter, Christian Jank, planned the palace's interior decoration, which drew on models taken from Baroque and Rococo buildings. However, their copies had a distinctive touch all over the room. Again, interesting connection between theatre sets, between operas, and between his buildings, and in a sense, they are all representing a heightened reality. They are all representing the realm of dreams, the Night King. Work on the building, which is more reminiscent of a prestigious villa than the palace, dragged on until 1876, although the king used the rooms as early as 1872. Construction would have lasted longer had not 180 workers been employed for some stretches of time, and the railroad built to enable speedier transport of building materials. So yes, you can say that he's building all of these grandiose Baroque Rococo style buildings, could be seen as some sort of throwback to the 18th century. Yet he's also willing to use sort of these grand new mechanical contraptions, such as the wishing table, such as importing light bulbs, such as central heating, all of these things. Even there was a plan for Neuschwanstein involving a Swan iteration of a ski lift to go down to the lake. He is at once, harkening back to Louis XIV, yet he's also this this steampunk equivalent of a monarch. Very much, I think the only figure I think of in that regard is probably Wilhelm II, later King of Prussia and Emperor of Germany. The court gardener, Karl Joseph von Effen, completed the plans of the garden around the palace in 1874, and they were carried out from 1880. From that time on, Linderhof has stood at the center of a geometric park modeled on the French Baroque and the Italian Renaissance, merging into an English landscape garden, which is bordered almost seamlessly by the mountain forest. In 1873, the king bought the Herren-Issel, Monk's Island, which refers to an old Augustinian monastery on the island, in Lake Chiemsee. The island provided him with a site large and secluded enough for the palace originally planned for Linderhof. Ludwig's aim was to build a temple of glory for Louis XIV. Versailles served as the direct inspiration for the facade and interiors, and its hall of mirrors and adjacent palace and wall saloons were copied almost exactly. The king's orders to his court secretary in December stated that the rooms must not be small. The mere illusion of size achieved by means of perspective is not enough to realize the majesty of that wonderful epoch. Ludwig II studied the available sources intently, had dramas from the time of the Bourbons performed at the Munich Court Theatre, which sets inspired by the rooms in Versailles, and read all the related literature he could lay his hands on, again referring back to his extensive memory. The decoration of the interiors and the murals in Harem Chiemsee was said to be based on the historical sources. There is even a text on French coins which featured the bust of Louis XIV in a true likeness, which should be used as a model, stated the king. This is just one example of his attention to detail. During this time, he sent artists on several trips to Versailles and other places, including Augustusburg Palace in Brühl near Cologne, the residence in Würzburg, and Fontainebleau near Paris. The artists then had to incorporate the things they had seen, particularly the interior decoration, in their plans following the king's wishes. Now, it's really going to irritate me. Maybe someone in the chat will remember. But around this time in France, during the height of Napoleon III's reign, who coincidentally will be deposed by Bismarck in the Franco-Prussian War, Napoleon III's reign coincided with this great period of restoration of all the damage done during the French Revolution. There was a great French restorer who was responsible for reviving the medieval city of Carcassonne. Indeed, this may seem anachronistic, but this is a time of great restoration work and it's a time of great builders across all of Europe. And indeed, he was very much inspired by seeing the restoration work in France, Ludwig. Accordingly, Herrenchiemsee, the construction of which began in 1878, is not just a copy of Versailles, but an enchantment of it, not of Ludwig's creation. Enhancement of it, if not of Ludwig's own creation. Based on descriptions, Ludwig had rooms built in Herrenchiemsee that were actually longer than Versailles. The designs of the facades and the gardens were also initially reminiscent of Versailles, though individual details were reproduced as exact copies of the original, but the choice of statues to adorn the palace garden, the facade, and the fixtures in the two large fountains are not based on Versailles, but rather Ludwig II's own artistic temperament and creative ideas for his palace. The king had the idea of placing cone-shaped rocks with sculptures in the water basins in front of Herrenchiemsee, after having seen the photographs of the royal palace near Madrid, which has similar fountains. In the north basin at Herrenchiemsee stands the fountain of the winged goddess of fame, Fama, with envy, deceit, and hate, falling from the rock. In the southern basin we see Fortuna, the Roman goddess of fate, fortune, standing on a wheel on top of the rock. Herrenchiemsee Palace is one of those castles which remained unfinished due to lack of funds and the king's early death. In order to understand it properly, we need to take account of the basic division into two groups of rooms. Ludwig II entered the Petit Appartement, which represented a symbolic interpretation. Yes, Viollet-le-Duc. Thank you very much, Sunikas in the chat, for posterity, Viollet-le-Duc. This is where Ludwig's private chambers were located, including his bedroom, decorated in shades of blue, and a study. Walking through a bare, unadorned, transitional passage, Ludwig II reached the Grand Gallery, the Mirror Gallery, from which he gained access to all the other rooms in the Grand Appartement, all of which are designed as purely symbolic, monumental rooms. In the middle of a palace like Versailles is the Chambre de Parade chamber, decorated completely in red. The state bedroom, which bears hardly any similarity to Versailles, was the first of the rooms to be completed in 1881. Ludwig saw the bed in Versailles as the center of his kingdom and the world, claiming that the sun rose as he got up and sank as he went to bed. This room at the center of Herrenchiemsee stands for Ludwig's religious veneration of the Sun King, a textile image showing Ludwig Louis XIV in his coronation robes. It's used on the back of the bed, which actually looks like a throne. The Sun King is commended to the Virgin Mary by Saint Louis IX. Again, just Louis IX, the Christian commendation, the Virgin King. Even if he had married Sophie, Sophie von Wittelsbach, there are historical parallels in terms of him being able to present to the world an image of marriage, even though he may have been well and truly gay and he had no interest in propagating the royal line, or indeed, if he wasn't gay, he had a general repugnance for physical acts of sex. I think the example actually exists in the medieval period again, if we're looking back to ancient comparisons, with Richard II of England. Richard II had no children, but he was married. I believe he was married twice. And because his first marriage didn't produce children, but he also had a very, like Ludwig II, a artistic conception and autocratic conception of his own monarchical role, and indeed very much tried to venerate himself as part of a pantheon of English saintly kings. Basically, you can say he wanted to emulate Louis IX, which was, a century before. All of this is to say that he conceived of his marriage posthumous, post hoc, not posthumously, post hoc, effectively, as a chaste union. It was a celibate marriage. Indeed, if he was ever going to get married, I think the best way to describe it is that he would come to resemble Richard II. Indeed, Richard II is possibly the closest thing England has to someone like a Ludwig II, and both kings in their own way would meet their pretensions in a lethal manner. Both of them would be deposed and ultimately killed, or in the case of Ludwig II, I do believe in suicide, though a lot of people do believe he was murdered. High above on the ceiling is a painting of the divine morning with the god Apollo and the chariot of the sun being carried off by Helios. This god of purification and truth is also depicted in the sealing room, in which Ludwig II was christened and thus accepted into the Fellowship of Christ in 1845, the organization. Ludwig decreed that the Nymphenburg fresco, the Nymphenburg Palace, by the way, is kind of like the greatest of the Wittelsbach references, residences outside of the residence in Munich. In fact, I believe it is actually the residence today of Franz, the titular Duke of Bavaria. The Nymphenburg fresco by Johann Baptist Zimmermann be used as a model for the ceiling painting of the state bedroom in Herrenchiemsee. Chiemsee. For the king, the fact that he was christened under the grace of the god Apollo, the emblem of Louis XIV, was powerfully symbolic. It is thus hardly surprising that the Bavarian monarch emphatically used, in his eyes, legitimate connection to Louis XIV in the stateroom of Herrenchiemsee. The fantastic themes represented in many of the small buildings around Linderhof are also to be found in the most famous castle that Ludwig ever constructed. In Neuschwanstein, near Fussen, the Nibelung legend meets Tannhäuser, Parsifal, Tristan, Isolde, and Lohengrin. Nor would the Orient represented by a Moorish hall have been left out, except that Ludwig II died before it could be built. Like Herrenchiemsee, Neuschwanstein, it is an unfinished palace, nevertheless reveals a great deal about its builder. In 1867, Ludwig initiated a new production of Wagner's Tannhäuser in the National Theatre, and in May of that year travelled to the historic locations associated with the medieval minstrel. Wartburg Castle near Eisenach and the Hosselberg Mountain, the location of Venus's cave according to legend. Venus's cave, Venusberg, a fundamental part of the first act of Tannhäuser. On one of his trips to Paris 2 months later, Ludwig set eyes on the Pierrefonds Castle, which was in the process of being restored as a private residence for Napoleon III. I am currently reading some very interesting books about knighthood in the Middle Ages. For the last days, I have been thinking of plans to rebuild the castle ruins near Hohenschwangau, which are very familiar and attractive due to their location. My aim is for the future castle to have more of the authentic medieval character of an old knight's castle than a castle like Hohenschwangau, Ludwig announced to his cousin in Darmstadt. The monarch became more definite in a letter to Richard Wagner. The location is one of the most beautiful you could find, sacred and remote, a worthy temple for my divine friend through whom all alone the world gained salvation and true blessings. You will also find reminders of Tannhäuser, the minstrel's hall with a view castle in the background, of Lohengrin, the castle courtyard, the open walkway, the path to the chapel. What at first sounded like a memorial to Wagner and his operas quickly became Ludwig II's own Grail castle at Montsalva. Work on the castle's construction began in 1869. 4 years later, Ludwig moved into his first living quarters in the gatehouse and watched the progress being made on the other poor parts of the castle, which were constructed in a Romanesque, not a Gothic style. In the main buildings, the parlors, the initial, most important, and the highest room was an imitation of the ceremonial hall in Wartburg, decorated with murals depicting the legend of Parsifal. Here, as in the castle as a whole, the king's guiding principle was that the pictures in the new castle should follow the legend and not the Wagnerian versions. An individual iconography was developed for each room by the king and literary historian Hyacinth Holland. Just reading that segment, I'm very much reminded of Tolkien brushing off comparisons between the Ring of the Nibelungen and Lord of the Rings. There is a ring, it is round, that is where the similarities cease, and of course Tolkien was being completely bloody-minded and disingenuous when he said that. However, that same mentality, the idea of we are both appealing to the same primary sources, yet there is no overlap between the secondary material which has been produced, i.e. Lord of the Rings and the Ring of the Nibelungen, both appealing to the original sagas. Ludwig II is basically doing the same thing here as Tolkien. Yes, he has been influenced by Wagner. Yes, Wagner is the spiritual counterpart to him, but he is going to represent his own versions of the same myths, which are intrinsically German in in the mindset of Ludwig, and not simply Wagnerian. He is a counterpart, not simply a disciple. Over the years, the throne room became the castle's central hall. It looks like a Byzantine church. So it's actually used on the right here, if you can see it. And not just because of its gold color. Even though a throne was supposed to stand in the place where one would expect an altar, the motifs of the wall paintings are clearly religious. They represent canonized kings, including Louis IX, as well as Jesus, Christ, Mary, John the Baptist, and the 12 Apostles. In his introduction to the new version of the poem Lohengrin, the Catholic publisher and scholar Joseph Gorez developed the hypothesis that the Byzantine Church in Hagia Sophia and Constantinople had been the model of medieval descriptions for this Grail temple. Ludwig was familiar with Gorez's text and had the throne room in Neuschwanstein built in the style of Hagia Sophia. As the Byzantine emperors took up the theme of divine right directly in their main church, two worlds of ideas came directly together for the Bavarian king: the idea of divine right, kings, and the idea of power of the Holy Grail. And that is one posited reason as to why Neuschwanstein, the throne room, has no throne, that it is not a throne room for the king to demonstrate his power, but is a Grail temple in the sense that it is an altar, it is a church for the Grail. If there is ever going to be pride of place, it is there to be rested, the place of the Grail. It is there to represent some modern version of Montsalvat. But here we come finally to the debts and the downfall. Ludwig II's buildings, his passion for the theatre, and his support of Richard Wagner, and his habit of generously distributing gifts cost a lot of money. There are many tales of him giving away priceless heirlooms, dynastic artifacts to actors when they essentially perform their role. And again, this would be consistent with, you can say, his manic behavior. If they came to represent some form of an ideal for him, which was attained on the stage, either the theatre stage or the opera stage, then Ludwig II would basically be donating to the ideal that they represented, not just giving priceless heirlooms to a random actor. He wouldn't see it that way, of course. The king covered all of these costs and more besides from his civil list. The civil list included funds allocated to their constitutional monarch, or to be precise, the cabinet treasury. This treasury administered the king's finances. Ludwig had to use this to cover all of his expenses, the rule of Bavaria, including the pensions of his staff, the upkeep of his households, and his castles, the court theatre, and further positions that also included maintaining his grandfather, the former Ludwig I. By the way, he died in 1868. He lived 20 years after his deposition, whose household expenses made up a quarter of the civil list until his death in 1868. And I do wonder, again, how much that actually represents the demarcation point between trying to emulate the legacy of his grandfather, who was still alive, and then entering this period of solitude and obsession with the pursuit of a perfect absolutism. The introduction of the mark as the currency throughout the Reich necessitated a new finance act, which Ludwig received more than 4.2 million marks annually. Beside this, in 1879 and 1883, Ludwig also drew around 5 million marks from capital reserves. In addition, he received the same amount of payments from Bismarck. Again, I note the irony: if Bismarck had effectively been the only the only figure in Germany to understand Ludwig and the potential for Ludwig. As Ludwig II was going to retain his alliance with the House of Hohenzollern, indeed, as he had been the one to gift the crown of German emperorship to Wilhelm I by offering it, the head prince offers it, and all of the other smaller princes come and follow Ludwig II, who is in the greatest position effectively to defy the creation of Germany. Bismarck copiously awards Ludwig II for this act of political alliance by effectively funding many of these projects in a way in which the Bavarian political system could not possibly understand or countenance. Yet for Bismarck, there was a political acumen there which could understand the utility in this, more so than perhaps the utility that his ministers could foresee. As high as this total seems, Ludwig's expenses were equally high. In 1877, at the latest, it became clear that the cabinet treasury was in trouble. Ludwig's buildings were devouring more money than the king had at his disposal. This was one of the reasons for the cabinet secretary's resignation, the cabinet secretary again being the liaison between the government and the king. Richard Wagner also felt the consequences of the situation, as Ignaz von Dollinger wrote to Charlotte Leyden in August of 1877. Richard Wagner was here to try and wrangle a significant sum of money out of the king. However, he failed, as the civil list is vastly in debt. And again, one of the main donations of Ludwig II, of course, was to primarily finance the Bayreuth Festival. The ministers had tried to keep out of the monarch's financial affairs, but by 1884, the mountain of debt had grown to 8.25 million marks, and a constitutional crisis was looming. Unpaid bills of craftsmen and artists meant that legal action against the cabinet treasury, and thus against the king, seemed likely. The monarchy's reputation was at risk. If the present debts are not paid very soon, there is risk that hundreds, perhaps even more livelihoods, will fall into economic ruin. And this fact alone represents a grave danger, as the justified complaints of those affected will resonate so widely that there will be no way of preventing them from reaching the steps of the throne, said the Minister of Finance to Ludwig. But how did all this result in the ultimate tragedy of Ludwig, where not only was he deposed, but ultimately he died? It wasn't simply a matter of wrestling with the financial situation. It represented his own oblivion and that effectively his legacy. And this is the account relayed by Durkheim in the biography by McIntosh. The events leading up to Ludwig's deposition are accounted by Durkheim in a revealing personal memoir, which is worth quoting extensively. He writes, "It was a great misfortune that for the king that in autumn of 1885 he did not go to Munich as he was normally due at that time of year. On the evening of the 10th of November, he was already on his way from Hohenschwangau when he suddenly gave the order to turn back and to proceed instead to Linderhof. After a few days there, he went to Hohenschwangau." Durkheim said that he never learned the reason for Ludwig's fateful change of mind, but speculates that it might have something to do with the finances. He continues, "This not coming to Munich in autumn of 1885 was a decisive turning point, the beginning of the end. The consequence that the king did not come to Munich in the winter. If he had come, the whole course of crisis would have been different. The catastrophe of 1886 would not have happened, or at least not in the way that it ultimately did. During the winter and the spring of 1886, there was a sudden disappearance of the loyalty and discretion that had hitherto been shown when the king's private affairs were discussed. Newspaper articles began to appear with increasing frequency, at first only abroad, but then in the Bavarian press. There was public discussion and criticism in all the beer houses, and no longer just about the financial calamities of the privy purse and the king's buildings, but about all of his majesty's habits, manner of living, and so on. There were insinuations of the worst kind about cavalrymen who, for a time, had been acting as lackeys, and the most exaggerated stories were told about presents to these people, about his majesty's maltreatment of them, etc. Remarkably enough, the police never intervened, although in public hostilities, the crudest kind of lèse-majesté was continually being uttered. Insult to the majesty of Ludwig. As always in such cases, relatively few people were the instigators. The majority listen, agree, or disagree, go home, and repeat what they have heard. It was very easy to create a mood when no hindrance is placed in the way. This is, again, reminder, this is a contemporary account by Durkheim, an eyewitness. It must occur to the impartial observer that there was a deliberate intention to create sentiments of hostility towards the person of the king. This would never have succeeded to the same extent that the king had been in Munich, as usual, from the middle of February to the middle of May. But there he stayed, far away, isolated in Hohenschwangau. What person could disapprove of the things that were being said about them in his mental condition? Count Holstein took me by the arm when he went behind me at the grandstand, as fewer people were circulating there in front, and then conversation ensued. So this is a reference with Holstein, who was the king's adjutant a few months later. Holstein says, "Things are getting worse all the time with the king. There's no holding him any more. He's a complete lunatic." I say, "Come now, you're exaggerating. I don't believe it." "No, no, it's true. You don't know all the details that I do. The king is also physically ill. He suffers from terrible congestion and headaches. He's also having to put an ice pack on his head. None of the people around him can stand it anymore. He mistreats them all. In the matter of money, he just won't listen to reason, and his behavior borders on treason." "What do you mean by that?" "The business with Orleans, from whom he wanted to ask a loan in favor of assurances of Bavarian's neutrality in the Franco-German war." This evidently referred to Prince Ferdinand of Orleans, the husband of Ludwig's former fiancée Sophie. Fortunately, the whole thing was thwarted before it could be carried out. That I absolutely refuse to believe. But yes, it is true, and now it really is high time that something were done. If anyone can help to throw light on the king's mental state, either through his own observations or through the possession of letters from his majesty and so forth, he should no longer hold back. You should also make yourself heard. You must have read letters from the king. Certainly I have, this going back to Durkheim, but they most emphatically do not prove that the king is mentally ill. On the contrary, in any case, what you ask is quite impossible. It goes against my position and my duty. Holstein replies, but I have a quite different opinion, because I am a good Bavarian. Holstein hinted at the danger of Prussia intervening if something were not done. The statement that he was a good Bavarian was of course self-serving, but it was in view of this. By the time of this conversation, the plot to depose Ludwig was already well advanced. The 65-year-old Prince Leopold, the uncle of the king, had agreed to the minister's plan that he should step in as regent. Immediately after this, the Bavarian envoy in Berlin, Count Lerchenfeld, had told Bismarck what was afoot. In a report to the foreign minister, Kreisheim, he described the conversation with Bismarck as follows. I explained briefly to the imperial chancellor that the mental condition of the king did not permit that the ruling of the country should be left in his hands. I pointed out, although it was a financial question that given the impetus towards grasping a speedy remedy, this was itself a secondary consideration to other sad things. I described the mood of the country, the impossibility of an orderly regime under the king. I told the prince that the person next in line to the throne, in agreement with ministers and government, had decided that the country could no longer be exposed to the incalculable dangers, things that had come to a limit in Bavaria. The imperial chancellor expressed a deep regret at the sad state of affairs. He found it deeply painful, as the king had always been a gracious benefactor to him. But if the king was unfit to rule because of his mental illness, then in all conscience he could no longer reason to keep him on the throne. This, of course, Bismarck was not prepared to more voraciously interfere in the state of Bavaria, of course, because it would be perceived universally as a contrivance of the arrangement of Bavarian sovereignty within the German Empire, overweening and over sort of zealous petty management, micromanagement, which of course Bismarck was not above doing when it comes to the Kulturkampf and his vindictiveness against certain ministers. But of course he was wise enough perhaps to understand that in Bavaria it would have been counterproductive, and Ludwig II wasn't indispensable to him by any means. Lerchenfeld then showed Bismarck a letter from Ludwig ordering that one of his servants be deported to America. This somewhat slender piece of evidence was apparently enough to convince Bismarck that Ludwig should be deposed. It is important to realize, however, the process of deposition was in no way started on Bismarck's initiative. The ways in which it was carried out went against Bismarck's advice. In his discussion with Lerchenfeld, he urged that the ministers should seek the authority of Parliament for what they were doing to avoid the appearance of a coup, the odium of which would fall on Prince Leopold. This advice was not followed, and the plot proceeded in a highly clandestine manner. What is really meant there by the appeal to the Parliament is that, as I referenced earlier, reading from a different kind of king, is that Parliament had the authority for the budget. The king was in many ways restricted and confined by his ministers, but he could still directly appeal to the Parliament, of which he actually had the approval of some Social Democrats and also some Conservatives. So he could have appealed above the views of his ministers, who were cocooning him, if not putting him in a coffin, literally, and stipulated that this could have been a question left to the Bavarian state budget. We can't really speculate on what the result would have been if the Parliament intervened against the Secretariat and against the cabinet of ministers, which were basically acting as an authority unto themselves in alliance with Prince Leopold and the House of Wittelsbach. But all of this essentially is to say that there was an avenue for reconciliation that wouldn't have made this seem like a coup, and that was essentially disbarred. So in many ways, you can look at this as a way for the ministers, Lutz, etc., the cabinet secretary, to hold on to their position and substantiate their continued government around a more stable figure like Prince Leopold, Leopold, who will usher in the Regency period within Bavaria that will last about 30 years before the First World War, which itself is a great period of cultural outpouring and a relative period of stability and industrialization for Bavaria, all of these things. So the ministers are wanting security and they're also wanting normalization. There is a way essentially that the king could have gone above their heads to appeal to parliament, but the king has no right of initiative. As Durkheim has basically said, the king is isolated. The king is definitely showing severe signs of some form of mental illness. There is an element of truth in all of these stories, albeit they're deliberately exaggerated. And the question of his mental health is now being exploited essentially to continue on with this plot to formally depose him. On the 23rd of March 1866, Lutz held a discussion about the king's mental condition with one Dr. Bernhard von Gudden, a distinguished expert on mental illness, who was a professor of psychiatry at the University of Munich. He was evidently a humane and enlightened person who had done much to advance the study of psychiatry and believed in handling insane patients with a minimum of restraint. Gudden listened carefully to what Lutz had told him and agreed that the evidence seemed to indicate that the king was suffering from a form of paranoia or primary madness, or possibly a variety of schizophrenia as we would see it today. According to a psychiatric textbook published in 1883, this form of insanity was characterized by a pathologically false conception of the relationship of oneself to the environment, in which healthy perception is impaired to a high degree by sensory illusions of all kinds, as well as through subjective interpretation of normal impressions, where all my delusions do not find rest, the anti-Warnfried. And again, this referring back to Gustave Doré, encased, surrounded by these images, these anachronistic elements. They are again looking at this, and it is his pursuit, his raison d'etre, his reason to be, that is effectively forming the mental and the medical impression that will result in his downfall. Following this meeting, it was agreed that Gudden would prepare a medical appraisal to provide the legal basis for deposition. Gudden had the reputation of being careful, rigorous, but in this case he made a serious professional blunder by agreeing to make his diagnosis without seeing the patient. Since it has been inconceivable that the king would allow himself to be examined by a psychiatrist, it was necessary to appraise the basal on documents and other people's observations. A search was now instigated to provide Gudden with the necessary information, hence Holstein's request to Durkheim for letters from the king. Those who joined Durkheim in refusing to cooperate included Berkel and Meyer. Despite his undignified treatment at the hands of Ludwig, Meyer did not testify until after the king's death. Many, however, came forward with documentary or eyewitness evidence, all of Ludwig's strange habits, his maltreatment of his servants, his rages, the gruesome punishments he ordered, his far-fetched schemes for raising money. One of these actually involved possibly robbing a bank in Frankfurt, his hallucinations. All of these were raked together and fed to Gudden and his colleagues. Some of the evidence was no doubt maliciously exaggerated by those of the king's entourage who had a grudge against him, but not all can be dismissed on those grounds. Hornig, for example, only agreed with great reluctance to help with the inquiry. He had nothing personal to gain by testifying against the king, and was not the kind of man to bear a grudge. The inclusion of his evidence, therefore, lends to at least some weight to Gudden's appraisal. Drawing up the appraisal, Gudden was aided by three other doctors, his son-in-law, von Herbert Grassi, Dr. Hagen, and Hubrich. It was dated on the 8th of June, 1866, and pronounced, "The mental powers of His Majesty are disrupted to such an extent that all judgment is lacking, and thinking is in total contradiction with reality. Gripped by the illusion that he holds absolute power in abundance, and made lonely by self-isolation, he stands like a blind man without a guide at the edge of the abyss." Even though that is a view formed perhaps by, again, hostile evidence and reasoning, I think you can see that that is actually a rather perceptive iteration, which is informed by many of the aspirations that I've actually put forward in this account. He stands like a blind man without a guide at the edge of the abyss. Without a guide, explicitly, of course, this isn't formally inducing Gooden's account, but it should also be noted that Wagner had died 2 years before, all the way going back to 1866, 1867. Ludwig had associated his longevity and his mortality with the mortality of Wagner. Wagner had died in Venice in 1883, and Ludwig had essentially described Neuschwanstein as a way basically to allow for Wagner and him to live forever. And of course, Wagner tragically never actually stepped foot in Neuschwanstein, nor do I believe he would have appreciated for its rather sort of, you can say, preposterous kitsch value in terms of how Wagner may have conceived it, albeit he would have been too politic and too sycophantic probably to explain that. Once Gooden and his team had completed their medical appraisal, events moved swiftly. On the 10th of June, a proclamation was issued announcing a regency. It was signed by Prince Leopold and the leading members of the government, and explained that the king was suffering from illness, and as Prince Otto was suffering from a similar illness. Prince Otto, by the way, was the younger brother of the king, and he was severely mentally ill. He was incarcerated, and even though he would actually become king, weirdly enough, up until 1913, and he wouldn't die until 1916, there are photographic evidence, say, for example, of the fact that he would never shave his beard. So, for example, legends of the king's beard, we go back to Prince King Otto. Although the constitution provided for a regency during a minority, or in the event of a monarch being unfit to rule for a prolonged period, it did not say who was entitled to establish the principle of a regency. Meanwhile, on the 9th of June, a commission had set out for Hohenschwangau to inform Ludwig of the steps taken and to place him into medical custody. The commission consisted of the following members: one Baron von Kreisheim, the minister responsible for the royal house and foreign affairs; Counts Hornstein and Toring, who had been named as the joint legal guardians of the king; one Dr. Karl Rumpler, secretary of the commission; Colonel Baron von Washington, who was to act as a sort of aide-de-camp, Dr. von Gooden, and his assistant Karl Müller, and a number of medical orderlies. The commissioners, sorry, the eccentric tribute, it was just one instance. All this is to say that his illness was far more in evidence than Ludwig's. The commissioners arrived at the old castle of Hohenschwangau late in the evening, and at about midnight sat down to supper to plan how they would tackle the king. I mean, there is an instance, the eccentric tripper, where Otto had no idea what was being read to him when he was announced that he was the king, for example. It was decided that first of all a message from Leopold would be read to him, that Gooden would step forward with his assistant and explain to the king what had happened and to be taken into medical care. They would then proceed with the king to Linderhof, where he was to be kept under supervision. Later, Berg was decided as a more suitable place of confinement. At 1 o'clock in the morning, Hornstein found Ludwig's coachman, one Fritz Osterholzer, harnessing the horses to the royal carriage as he normally did at that time in the case the king wished to go for a night ride. Hollenstein told him to put the horses away, and when Osterheim remonstrated against this and would not go against the king's command, Hollenstein replied that it was now the Prince Leopold and not the king who would give the command. Realizing what was afoot, Osterholzer slipped off and made his way up to Neuschwanstein. Again, it should be noted that if the king was so vilified by all of his entourage, why would other members of his entourage show him such loyalty in the situation and not see this as a form of liberation? The king was pacing up and down his singers' hall, reference from the Meistersingers, declaring verses from Schiller when the coachman, breathless and incoherent, was ushered in. When Ludwig finally understood Osterholzer's message, he was incredulous, and at first refused to accept that there could be any danger. If there were, he said, Hesselschwert would have warned him. He did not know that Hesselschwert had been zealously cooperating in the conspiracy. At length, however, Ludwig ordered that the entrance to the castle be barred, and his own guard be reinforced by a contingent of police from Futzen, the closest town to Neuschwanstein. At the same time, he asked that the local fire brigades be alerted. The commissioners in the meantime had learned that the king had not warned of their presence and decided that there was not a moment to lose. Towards 4 o'clock in the morning, they drove up the steep, winding road to Neuschwanstein through cold, driving rain. Slowly the dawn began to break, and the looming outline of the castle came dimly into view against the mist-laden slopes beyond. They arrived at the gates to find them guarded by gendarmes, who stoutly refused to admit them. At this point, a bizarre comedy of errors intervened, in the shape of an eccentric old lady of Spanish descent, named the Baroness Sperser von Troschus, a famous figure in Munich society for her colourful personality and lavish parties. She was already known to Dr. Gooden, as she had been an inmate of his asylum on a number of occasions. The Baroness was an ardent admirer of the king, and often stayed at the Alpine Rose Inn at Hohenschwangau in the hope of catching an occasional glimpse of the king. Now, accompanied by her landlady and a female servant, she appeared brandishing a parasol and proceeded to berate the members of the commission for their shameful disloyalty. Gaining access to the castle, where the commission had failed, she was taken to the king. She implored him to travel at once to Munich and offered to accompany him. Ludwig politely refused, and it was several hours before the Baroness could be persuaded to leave. At about 5 past 5 in the morning, the commissioners climbed back into their carriages and returned to Hohenschwangau, feeling disconsolate and humiliated. But an even worse humiliation awaited them. Soon after their arrival at the old castle, a detachment of local police arrived with orders from the king to arrest them. They were then marched into two groups up to Neuschwanstein again, passing on the way groups of local people who jeered at them. By now, the whole neighborhood knew what was happening. On arrival at Neuschwanstein, the commissioners were imprisoned in the gate lodge, where they learned that the king had ordered that their eyes should be put out, that they should be flogged and starved. These orders were not carried out, but the group spent a terrifying and uncomfortable 2 hours waiting. Meanwhile, Rumpler, alone of the commissioners, had managed to escape any report of the plight of the others. A message was sent to the officer in charge of the police detachment at Neuschwanstein, informing him of the proclamation of the regency and ordering him to release the prisoners. This he decided to comply with, and the commissioners were allowed to go. By late in the evening, they were back in Munich, feeling thoroughly foolish. At this juncture, Ludwig could still have saved himself by taking resolute action, but now a sort of paralysis of the will had overtaken him. Shortly after the departure of the commission, Count Durkheim arrived on the king's urgent summons and urged him to go to Munich, where he was sure to be loyally received by the people. But Ludwig shook his head and said that the air of Munich did not suit him. Durkheim then suggested that they go across the border to the Austrian Tyrol, which was only half an hour's carriage ride away. Again, Ludwig declined. He was tired, he said, and anyway, what would he do in the Tyrol? He did, however, consent to send a number of telegrams. One went to Bismarck, informing the Chancellor of his plight. Another went to Frankenstein, Baron von Frankenstein, not the fictional one Frankenstein, who was to come for consolations about forming a new government of which he could head. Again, the irony, actually, of von Frankenstein coming to lead a government of the Mad King. Durkheim prudently had these telegrams sent from Reuter across the Austrian border. Frankenstein duly received his in Marienburg and loyally set out to consult with the king. But he was intercepted in Munich and told that he were not allowed to go further. Bismarck replied immediately with the same advice that Ludwig had been given repeatedly. He should go to Munich, rally the support of his people. But even the Iron Chancellor's advice failed to stir Ludwig into action. To me, I think that element is probably the most damning piece of evidence when it comes to this being a royal coup. The fact that there was clearly a constitutional means of reconciling his situation by appealing to the parliament and by appearing in Munich. Durkheim is possibly correct in the view that he believes that if the king made a more active personal statement effectively to counteract the plotters, it could have very easily been dismantled. And again, the acquiescence, or at least you can say the apathy, the non-interference policy of Bismarck would have been enough essentially to isolate the perpetrators. But of course, in the event, Ludwig showed no initiative, and ultimately the orders he gave were countermanded. And finally, Ludwig consented essentially to be kept in prison and placed under the care of Dr. Gooden. What essentially happens then is a sort of great period of conjecture. He's placed under the care of Dr. Gooden in Berg, and they go out for a trip one morning, now the king being a mental inmate. And they go for several hours. When they don't return, a search party is sent out. And then they find two bodies floating in Lake Starnberg. And the prevailing theory is that Ludwig committed suicide, and von Gudden either was killed by Ludwig or was also drowned. One theory, which I believe is probably correct, is that the icy water may have given him a heart attack as he was trying to save Ludwig in the water. But if Ludwig was truly in a manic state without inhibition, it's possible that he could have killed von Gudden, as his mind was so impaired at the time and he was desperate for oblivion. There is a theory that there were people in the lake, there was a boat in the lake, and this was all part of an elaborate rescue plan for him to be taken away to resume his throne, and ultimately he was murdered to prevent that happening. There are a couple of reasons I don't believe that. I think there's enough evidence if you look all the way back to Ludwig's obsession with his own mortality and death as to why he would ultimately decide to do this despite his devout Catholicism. Ultimately, his own pervading desire for his perfect absolutism, even in the realm of fantasy, was supreme above any sort of religious consideration. And what worse fate can there really be for a king who spent his entire life aspiring to this absolutism to be left as a medical inmate? And again, to make matters worse, and also to illustrate the fact that this really was a coup, um, he was deposed as king. He was forced to abdicate. It wasn't simply a regency was placed. Because Dr. Gooden gave the advice that he could never recover, even though the diagnosis was primitive madness. Prince Otto, now King Otto of Bavaria, definitely could never recover because he was in a far more advanced state of quote-unquote madness. And placing him on the throne was actually a Duarte political decision which would make Prince Leopold the permanent regent and not just the temporary regent. The reason why Ludwig II was deposed and his insane brother was placed in power is because Prince Otto would never recover. This may have led to major constitutional issues if Ludwig II did recover, but of course that didn't happen. Ludwig II, in all likelihood, committed suicide. And I have many sort of allusions to this as to the irony of this, is that in many ways Ludwig II mirrors Wagner's Götterdämmerung, or the Ring cycle in general. At the beginning of Rheingold, the payment for the construction of Valhalla, which is probably the closest thing Ludwig II has to Neuschwanstein. And it should also be noted that Ludwig I, in his grandiose aspirations to neoclassicism and Greek history, had constructed his own Valhalla for the heroes of German nationalism. So Valhalla was very much part of the overall conception of the Wittelsbach's patronage of the arts. Ludwig II had built his own version of Valhalla. But like Wotan, this Valhalla was predicated on a promise that Wotan would eventually renege on, which is he pays Fasolt and Fafnir with the ring that will ultimately destroy Valhalla, which is the Ring of Power. And in the first instance, of course, this causes Fafnir to murder Fasolt. But in the end, at the end of Götterdämmerung, Valhalla crashes into the sea. So the original promise in which to build his fantasy autocracy, his great palaces, like the Wagnerian epic, resolves essentially in the same way. And again, just I was thinking at the end of the stream of quoting Lohengrin or quoting Götterdämmerung because all the allusions are there. Brunhilde deciding to commit suicide after the death of Siegfried, which in this case could be analogous to perhaps Ludwig committing suicide after the death of Wagner, albeit Ludwig only decided to commit suicide at the point where his aspirations to royal absolutism were effectively destroyed. So all of this is to indicate that there are many Wagnerian parallels one can draw to this. Of course, in the case of Lohengrin, the Prince of Brabant is drowned on the orders of a witch, essentially, transformed into the idea is he drowned. In reality, he was transformed into a swan. At the end of the opera, the prince, again, my memory serves, Prince Gottfried, is transformed back into his human form from the lake, from the Swan, and becomes king again. I think that to me again very much mirrors the analogies one has with the king under the mountain, and why the death of King Ludwig II in Lake Starnberg is so iconic in terms of the mythology of the king, because you have all of these allusions to the king of Bavaria, the eternal king, the king who will rise again. But in terms of analyzing this deposition, you can say that, yes, say for example, Louis XVI died uh, in a horrific way, but in many ways, Ludwig's fate is worse for being more banal than a revolutionary death like Louis XVI, because King Louis of France was the victim of a devout anti-religious fanaticism, whereas Ludwig was the victim of a soulless, mundane, self-interested bourgeois managerialism encapsulated in figures like Lutz and corrupt aides-de-camps like Holstein. This is really coupled with the first inklings of the therapeutic state, that all of these medieval aspirations need to be confined within properly established patterns of behavior. Um, so the irony, of course, we have the overlooked potential of everything that Ludwig II could represent. The deposition of him is effectively the result of self-servingness, but also a lack of vision in many ways. I mean, I believe there's even an analogy where Bismarck, in terms of his defense of Ludwig II, basically said, "Why don't you continue to finance Ludwig? Because he's going to create all of these things which will instantly elevate Bavaria in the cultural forum." And of course, he was right, because the king's debts were extensive, but they weren't earth-shattering. They weren't going to bankrupt Bavaria by any means. Bavaria was much larger in its economy than the civil list that was being given over to Ludwig. And of course, Ludwig has left Bavaria with an indelible cultural legacy. So, in the same way that Wagner was berated at the time for being a second Lola Montez, um, it sort of shows again that Ludwig, in his way of aspiring to the religious eye of art and culture and politics being infused, had a much more realistic vision in terms of his legacy and posterity than any of his ministers, all of which, apart from interest around Ludwig, have been forgotten. But Ludwig is iconic, as with his association with Wagner, and even independent of his figure like Wagner. So it really is the banality of his deposition, the reasons for his deposition, that make it so sort of pathetic and terrible in the end. But of course, despite this, he acts as some ancient and primal force, which is in many ways a cornerstone of Bavarian particularism. And just to, in my view, compounding on this idea of the suicide of Ludwig II being accurate, but also being influential in its own way in terms of the whole mythos of the 19th century in Germany. I am coming at this from, yes, and someone in the chat, in the end, as I referenced with Gabriel Annunzio in the introduction, he was truly a king, but he was only the king of his dreams. And when he woke up and he found himself as a mental inmate, he decided to kill himself, which is looking at Ludwig and seeing his influence on other royal figures. And I come at this from an Austrian angle. And in a few years later, after the death of Ludwig, there is the affair at Mayerling, in which the heir to the Austrian throne, Rudolf, involves himself in a murder-suicide pact with his mistress, Fitzsara. And it's actually true that there is a major connection there. So Ludwig's fate actually compounds a further tragedy, which is one of the greatest scandals of the 19th century and rocks the Habsburg monarchy, the Austrian Empire, to its core. Remember the Austrian Empire, which was just across the border and he could have fled to in the Tyrol. And I've mentioned Requiem for a Virgin King at the beginning of this stream, but there is another film I would recommend everyone watch because it's really quite wonderful. It's Visconti's Ludwig II. And in that film, I mean, the problem with the film basically is that it doesn't have a definitive version in any language. There are Italian scenes, there are English scenes, there are German scenes. So if you want the full version of the film, you basically have to go across languages in order to watch it. But regardless, one of the things that the film tried to get across is that they alluded to his homosexuality quite strongly, but they also alluded to his infatuation, perhaps romantic infatuation, with the Empress Elizabeth. The Empress Elizabeth, of course, was the older sister of Sophie. And in many ways, I think her personality, the instability, the restlessness, the all the aspects I think that are mirrored somewhat in Ludwig in a more extreme way, and also her fetishization of Hungary, just for one example, and a desire to be patronized by Hungary, um, mean that Elizabeth, Cece, is in some ways a counterpart. That, and of course, she also had a tragic end in that she was assassinated, and that her son went through all of this and went through his murder-suicide pact. But the possibility is brought up in that film that the Empress Elizabeth and Ludwig could have potentially been lovers. Obviously, in terms of Ludwig's own imagination, the Empress Elizabeth thought in many ways, she loved him, mon cousin. But in the end, she's essentially belittling everything that he's creating as representing this absolutism which is found in the realm of ideas. So that is a core component of the film, the jealousy over Franz Josef and his marriage to the Empress Elizabeth. And the reason I bring that up is because this idea is actually born out from Rudolph's own point of view, Prince Rudolph, because in another world, Prince Rudolph, Crown Prince Rudolph of Austria, could have been the son of Ludwig. And when Prince Rudolph is thinking about his murder-suicide pact, he is consciously looking at the example of Ludwig and deciding to imitate it. So just sort of continue on, because I think it's an interesting way to sort of end this stream in terms of looking at the legacy of Ludwig II beyond just the cultural legacy, but also this morbid necrophiliac association with death and suicide. And this is an article by Rudolf Binion. I include all of these links in the description. But he starts off with the deposition of Ludwig II. Late on June the 11th, with the Second Commission approaching, Ludwig, imprisoned in his castle, had said of the barber, figuratively at the point, but prefiguratively too, "Tell Hopper, when he comes to do my hair tomorrow, that he can look for my head in the river." And now the words Rudolf put under Mary's pencil, literary, excepting the Danube for Lake Starnberg, express Ludwig's posture towards his chaperone Gudrun at the end of their final outing, and more, since Unwebertar in Donau, literally taken, unsavability in the Danube, points less ambiguously than does beyond saving to Gudrun, having been able to pull Ludwig back out of the water. This is an association with Lake Starnberg occupying a pivotal place in the mindset of Rudolf. But in the case of Rudolf, it is to drown in Danube, essentially to be consumed by the artery of the Austrian Empire and all of those ambitions, therefore. But they are very sort of polarizing personalities in the sense that Ludwig II, if he is the Virgin King, Rudolf was he was the syphilitic prince. There were, apart from this doom that they both shared, Rudolf was perhaps terminally ill due to his syphilis in a way that Ludwig II essentially was bound by this form of madness. The long of the short is, then, that Rudolf modelled his death on Ludwig's. But why did he do so? He did try to escape Ludwig's fate, yet Ludwig's fate overtook him. In the process, like Gudrun overtaking Ludwig. He may have beckoned it behind his own back out of timeless old jealousy of Elizabeth, who had shunned Ludwig alive for long years, past only to feel as if wedded to him in blood and spirit upon death. That's what I mentioned earlier. Elizabeth was, while rapturous, also inward and abstract in her necrophilia. Not necrophilia in the way that you will understand it, but necrophilia taken literally as to be the obsession and love of death. Rudolf, though, was outward and concrete in seeking from time to time, as he said in 1883, the opportunity of watching someone die and hearing him breathe his last. It was always a remarkable spectacle, and all of the people I have seen die, and each has died in a different way. One must learn to take life, to final needs into account. He missed the mortal show with Ludwig, but could try reconstructing it in the area from their relatives, informed of their accounts, and from the records of exhaustive inquests completed before the funeral. In Vienna, he had rummaged through his mementos of his lofty friendship with Ludwig, the more nostalgically for having just spoiled the marriage that he had spoiled. He destroyed Ludwig's first papers, post-dating his engagement to the true angel. With that, he left Ludwig's asseverations of vitality unto death, which he responded in kind. He too was a suggestive influence attending his motive for dying, and that motive itself deriving as it did from the morbid idea that he might be the heir to the insanity which he claimed for Ludwig as the victim. Again, this weird, almost literal association that he is the son of Ludwig, which lends theory again to this idea of Ludwig II being in love with Elizabeth, requiring for its validation that he be victimized in the same way, all the inconsistencies notwithstanding. Rudolph's case is not singular, but the same mechanism, as serves a relieving shock in one's own past experience, serves also when an experience of someone else's is relived. But who, generally speaking, relives whose experiences? One possibility that history suggests 100-fold is the successor to high office or estates whose predecessor has met a sudden, premature, unnatural death. Nominally, Rudolf was not Ludwig's successor, but the last of Ludwig's letters he saved was a fragment containing that line about bequeathing him Austria, and Rudolf's own successor as heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary adapted Rudolf's fatal situation, as he saw it himself. Again, this idea that had that note existed, had Ludwig II decided in a final attempt to thwart Prince Leopold and the elevation of his mad brother, that he was going to will the throne to Austria, it would have been some sort of bizarre reconciling of what happened in the War of Bavarian Succession in the 1770s. It would have been completely impossible due to the dynamics of the German Empire, but nevertheless, that idea that Ludwig II is some sort of grand patron in death, all of these things infecting that highly romanticized mindset, the fact that the poetic ideal, if it cannot be found in life, then effectively in the Wagnerian terms, the one act that will resolve all of these things, the one act that enables one to essentially rebel against the environment one finds oneself in, is to become enjoined in eternity and death. It is incredibly morbid, but this is again to say that Ludwig was influential to many people in many profound, disturbing, amazing ways, which is why I find him so endlessly fascinating. But that, again, that particular instance of Rudolph and the Mayerling affair is what in many ways actually spurred my interest on, in terms of understanding the whole nature of Ludwig's death, that there was a community of death, a community of suicide, as horrifying as that is to consider. And this all again stems back from my central premise, which is he is the Night King, he is the Lord of Dreams, and now he is asleep, he has received his eternal night. He has sought in life his version of a perfect royal absolutism. But as a lot of people who are quite perspicaciously saying in the chat, it is that pursuit of the perfect absolutism which is causing the therapeutic state, this mindless, visionless managerialism, to revolt against him and to annihilate him effectively. And it is that political annihilation which, for all of his aspirations and his romantic ideals and his pursuit of the physical construction of palaces and his friendship with Wagner, all of those things are gone. And so finally, he remains just the king of his dreams. So that is where I'm going to leave it for the stream. Yes, and someone actually is mentioning a weird parallel with Mishima's death. Yes, essentially. If I cannot exist in the ideal that I have set for myself, the all the way going back to State and Power with Wagner, the idea that monarchy must exist beyond the writ of rivalries and beyond the writ of politicians. But if one is to look at the religious eye and superimpose this into the realm of pure abstractions, then really the only release in the situation, if there isn't some sort of Christian element to this, the secular equivalent, the artistic equivalent, the Schopenhauerian equivalent would be death. But of course, the opposition from Rudolph to Ludwig, if Ludwig is to be some form of perverse iteration of a perpetual virgin, then Rudolph definitely was not. Right. James Bogus says nothing for £5. Well, thank you very much for your sticker. The eccentric tripper for $10. Great stream as always, AM. You are a legend. Had Ludwig stood in the way of united Germany rather than enabling it, would any of the monarchies of Germany still exist in some form? Are you trying to say, had Ludwig stopped it, that would have been good for monarchy, as in if Ludwig kept Bavaria independent. Um, in many ways, I actually think that for Ludwig specifically, the situation was probably the best outcome for him. Uh, interestingly, as that seems, either he would have been an impoverished and isolated king of Bavaria, which would have hastened his demise, or he could have been a wealthier, more influential prince within the German Empire. Had the German Empire been that as had been conceived during the Frankfurt Parliament in 1848, 1849, which is fundamentally democratic, then Ludwig definitely would have opted for sovereignty under all circumstances, I believe. But it was the fact that it was sold to him, and he came to believe that the German Reich, the Kaiserreich, was basically a reformulation of the Holy Roman Empire, as had been the model for Bavaria. The whole idea of Bavarian sovereignty is a very niche idea in the grand scheme of its history. For 800 years, it has basically been a dependent, not a sovereign state, and that, of course, exists within Germany today. Not so much good, more like would the institutions have meandered on into modernity. Yeah, well, I mean, in the case of Bavaria, Leopold had a son, Leopold III, who made a rule retroactively that allowed him to depose Otto and make himself king after an arbitrary time had affected Otto's regency. So he technically follows Otto as King Leopold III in 1913. He fights alongside Wilhelm I, Wilhelm II in the First World War. And then when the communist revolution breaks out in Bavaria, he tries to make a getaway, and actually, sort of, one of his cars actually falls down into a ditch, and that's the end of the Bavarian monarchy. It's not some sort of grandiose operatic saga as we see encapsulated in someone like Ludwig II, which is why I brought up this idea that he is this de facto terminus of the House of Wittelsbach, because what happens after him is far more banal, um, which I think is the case for many of the German principalities, Saxony, Württemberg. Um, yeah, many of the German principalities effectively become just Leopold-esque in the end. Okay, thank you everyone for listening, and I'm just going to find the ending video and leave it there. So thank you.